Picture yourself opening your eyes one day to find the sea is shifted. Not just a short distance, but far inland, covering the shore your community had called home for millennia. Generations before you had constructed villages and nurtured families, cultivating complex customs and daily practices. And now, all of it has disappeared. Engulfed by an endless succession of waves, not a single dramatic flood, but an unyielding advance, season after season, generation after generation, until whole terrains slipped under the water. This very scenario unfolded 11,600 years ago, wiping out societies we are only just now unearthing. In our usual view of the distant past, we tend to think of Egypt and Mesopotamia. The earliest urban centers appeared roughly 5 millennia ago, and that's when we're taught civilization truly started. Yet that narrative has a flaw as vast as the ocean itself. The prime shoreline territories, precisely where people would logically have established their most sophisticated communities, are missing from the picture. Today, it lies concealed beneath hundreds of feet of water, resting there for more than 11,000 years. If you've tuned in to drift off, then this is exactly the right place. That's the whole purpose of my work. So consider subscribing and drop a note about your location and the local time. I do read through your comments, and the range of places is amazing. Somewhere it's dawn in Tokyo, midday in London, and the dead of night in Los Angeles, yet all of you are listening to this tale at once. Now, here's a mystery that leaves archaeologists restless. Every civilization across the globe carries flood legends, absolutely every one. You're certainly familiar with Noah's Ark. What you might not realize is that the Mesopotamians possessed the Epic of Gilgamesh, containing a strikingly similar deluge account set down a millennium before the Bible. The Greeks spoke of Deucalion's great flood. Hindu scriptures tell of Manu surviving a massive inundation, and Chinese lore preserves the Gunu legend of overwhelming waters. Aboriginal Australians carry Dreamtime traditions about the ocean climbing and overwhelming coastal terrain. From the Pacific Northwest to the Amazon, Native American peoples recount tales of floods that consumed the world. For hundreds of years, academics brushed these aside as mere folklore, simplistic legends, or religious symbolism, nothing more. Yet what if these are not just myths? What if they are recollections altered by ages of storytelling and clothed in divine or magical terms, because early humans lacked any other way to interpret what they saw, yet still anchored in an actual disaster that almost annihilated civilization before it could truly take root? This tale begins with ice, and a great deal of it. 20 millennia ago, our planet was locked within the last glacial maximum. Continental glaciers up to 2 miles deep stretched across much of Canada, northern Europe, and portions of Asia. This wasn't merely a cold season. It was a geological era of deep freeze that persisted for millennia. Yet there's a detail that seldom crosses our minds. Every bit of that ice was water once held in the seas. With that much moisture trapped within the glaciers, ocean levels fell by roughly 400 feet. 400 feet. Imagine a 40-story tower's worth of ocean simply removed, transformed into frozen mass resting upon land. Such a dramatic drop in sea level reshapes the planet. Shorelines reach hundreds of miles farther out than they do in our time. Land bridges emerge connecting continents. The submerged shelves near the coasts, the most productive and abundant zones of the sea, turn into dry ground, ideal for habitation. And that is precisely where human beings made their homes. The most sophisticated Ice Age societies were not spread haphazardly over the landmasses. Instead, they gathered upon what we now refer to as the continental shelves, coastal plains that currently rest under 200 to 400 feet of ocean. Then, approximately 14,700 years back, the planet's climate turned chaotic. Ice began melting at an astonishingly rapid pace, far quicker than expected. Sea levels climbed at a speed that would alarm today's climatologists. Yet the true devastation arrived toward the close of what geologists term the Younger Dryas. This period marked the final shudder of Ice Age chill, a 1,300-year climatic crisis, beginning about 12,900 years ago. When temperatures unexpectedly dropped again to near glacial levels, its exact source remains uncertain. Perhaps a meteor strike, Perhaps a huge surge of glacier meltwater upsetting ocean circulation. Perhaps a combination. The crucial point, though, is what occurred when it finally finished. 11,600 years ago, the younger Dryas came to a close not slowly, but suddenly. In just a few decades, or even a few years in certain areas, worldwide temperatures surged. The last glaciers broke apart, and the seas climbed during what researchers label Meltwater Pulse 1b, among the swiftest marine transgressions ever recorded in the geologic record. The ocean did not advance uniformly across the globe, yet in many places, shorelines moved inland by tens of miles over the span of one lifetime. Envision the water creeping ever nearer each year, consuming your farmland, your settlement, your holy places, every creation of a culture that had endured for millennia. To those who survived it, the experience would surely have felt like the apocalypse, and indeed, in a genuine sense, the world they knew was coming to an end. The Ice Age coastal civilizations were submerged and lost. The greater part of the archaeological record revealing their identity, their constructions, and their knowledge now lies hidden, entombed beneath hundreds of feet of mud and seawater. However, not everything is gone. Over the past few decades, underwater researchers have started uncovering submerged structures that ought not to be there. Precisely arranged stone configurations, geometric shapes, workshops filled with tools, and even possible building foundations, all resting on the continental shelf, at depths that align perfectly with shorelines from 11,600 years ago. Beneath the waves, the proof lies in wait, and the tale it reveals upends all our previous assumptions. Human civilization did not start a mere 5 millennia ago. Its origins stretch far deeper into the past. Our search has simply been directed toward the wrong locations. We have scoured the dry earth, yet the true narrative is inscribed across the seabed. Prepare to have your perspective shifted. All that you believe regarding early human culture rests upon findings taken from misleading sites. Our attention has been fixed on uplands, mountain hollows, and interior waterways, territories that have forever remained dry. Yet 15,000 years ago, the majority of humanity did not reside there. The true hubs of population where communities flourished and crafted their most advanced ways of life now lie submerged, inundated, and entombed beneath hundreds of meters of sea. At the height of the last glacial maximum, some 20 millennia in the past, the planet presented an entirely altered scene. Ocean levels stood about 120 meters, nearly 400 feet below their present mark. To grasp the scale, that is greater than the height of a 30-story structure. Such a volume of water had vanished from the seas. Where had it retreated? It lay imprisoned within vast glaciers. Enormous ice fields enveloped much of Canada, northern Europe, and large parts of Asia. In places, the frozen layer exceeded a mile in thickness, bearing down upon the land with such force that the terrain itself warped, sinking into the planet's deep interior, much as a thumb makes an impression in soft clay. For regions that escaped the ice, the consequences were profound. Vast territories, enormous swaths of the continental shelf, now hidden beneath the waves, stood exposed and arid in that era. These were by no means peripheral lands. Rather, they ranked among the most abundant habitats Earth had to offer. Consider today's shorelines for a moment. They are centers of activity. A vast majority of global metropolises hug the coast, and most people reside within 60 miles of the sea. The explanation is simple. Coastal zones are where the gifts of land and ocean converge. Rivers deliver fresh water. Inland regions offer game, and the sea provides fish and shellfish. Migratory birds trace the shoreline, while plant life flourishes at the meeting point of diverse habitats. It is an endless feast, and picture those same coastlines extending hundreds of extra miles outward. Such was the Earth during the glacial epoch. Those coastal lowlands, the immense territories presently submerged, were not barren. Instead, they represented the most desirable terrain, the ideal settings for human cultures to grow and prosper. Let us begin with Doggerland. If the name is unfamiliar, there is no shame, for few know it. 15 millennia ago, however, this territory formed the very core of northern Europe, an expansive lowland nearly as large as present-day Britain, linking the British Isles to the European mainland. The North Sea today is a cold, dark body of water some 200 feet deep. But before it existed, the area was home to undulating hills, river-cut valleys, thick forests, and grassy plains. Clues dredged up by fishing boats confirm that Doggerland was never a desolate expanse. It teemed with human life. Nets have yielded flint implements, worked wooden pieces, and butchered animal skeletal remains. In 2010, a fisher pulled from the depths a piece of a human cranium over 13,000 years old, lying casually among the bones of mammoths, woolly, rhinoceroses, and other Pleistocene giants. These findings, however, were not casual discards from wandering bands. The sheer concentration of discoveries points to sizable communities. Certain researchers believe that in the waning Ice Age, Doggerland may have sustained a human population equal to or even greater than that of the neighboring uplands. Northern Britain and Scandinavia remained partly frozen, bitter and unforgiving. Yet Doggerland enjoyed a comparatively gentle climate, sheltered from the full severity of the glacial era. Its lands were watered by great rivers flowing off the continent, and it teemed with game, fish, and edible vegetation. This must have ranked among the finest homes in all of Northern Europe, and its inhabitants were well aware of that fact. For millennia, communities raised families there, nurturing regional customs, exchange routes, and inventive technologies. And then the Great Thaw began. On the opposite side of the globe, an even more expansive, drowned realm underwent the same destiny. The Sunda Shelf of Southeast Asia dwarfs Doggerland entirely. At the peak of the last ice age, oceans receded so dramatically that the entire shallow seabed linking the Asian mainland with the Indonesian archipelago rose above the water. Think of a territory spanning about the dimensions of India ground that united present-day Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Borneo into one gigantic landform. We now refer to it as Sunderland, but in that age, it was simply the known world to its inhabitants. And what a magnificent world it was, graced with tropical and subtropical climates. Rivers that now pour into the South China Sea, the Java Sea, and the Gulf of Thailand once traced their courses across this open plain, forming immense networks of waterways that replenished huge lakes and lush marshlands. From the sparse archaeological material, we can collect both beneath the water and on islands that once stood as highlands in this vanished terrain. It appears that this region sustained thriving human groups for tens of millennia. Flint implements recovered from Sunderland display advanced production methods, and signs of deliberate woodland stewardship hint at emergent agricultural practices. There are researchers who suggest that Sunderland could have been one of the birthplaces of rice farming, where the shift from collecting wild rice to deliberate cultivation took place on river plains now submerged beneath 150 feet of water. If this is correct, one of the greatest technological turning points in human history unfolded in a location that is nearly impossible for us to examine, as it has lain beneath the waves for 8 millennia. Far from being primitive wanderers barely surviving, the inhabitants of that land, based on genetic evidence from today's Southeast Asians, had ancestors who inhabited the area without interruption for more than 50,000 years. 50,000 years worth of gathered wisdom, technical progress, and cultural transformation. That span exceeds the whole record of Middle Eastern agriculture and dwarfs the age of Egyptian civilization tenfold. What creations came from those 50,000 years? What discoveries did they make? What customs emerged? The answers remain lost to us. The great majority of the evidence now lies beneath the sea, hidden below countless layers of ocean silt, or erased by the violent waters that overwhelmed their homelands. Then we come to Beringia, the land bridge linking Asia and North America. It is widely remembered because it served as the route for the first peopling of the Americas, roughly 15 to 20,000 years ago at the time of lowest sea levels. A plain stretching 1,000 meters in width joined Siberia and Alaska, and the first humans simply walked over it to start populating the Americas. However, the common textbook version misses an important truth. Beringia was not merely a passageway, a narrow route to another land. It was a world unto itself, a vast expanse of tundra grassland known to scientists as the Mammoth Steppe, sustaining enormous herds of megafauna. Great beasts, woolly mammoths, wild horses, bison, and caribou roamed what was essentially an ice age, Serengeti, that reached all the way from Europe to Canada. And human beings dwelled there, not simply traveling across, but truly making it home for thousands of years. Excavations at sites along the eastern and western margins of Beringia now reveal that its people were numerous and semi-sedentary, far from ceaseless wanderers. They set up seasonal campsites, came back to the same spots season after season, and gradually formed unique cultural practices rooted in their own regions. Certain geneticists propose that a group of Beringian people stayed on the land bridge in isolation for several millennia, cut off from both the Asian societies to the west and the American ones to the east. In time, they would have evolved distinctive genetic markers, their own ways of life, and particular adjustments to the singular landscape of that vanished territory. But when the oceans climbed, they vanished as well. Some may have traveled eastward into the Americas or westward into Asia, while others may have perished along with their sunken country. The middle portion of Beringia, the core region where the greatest numbers of people may have lived, now rests beneath the Bering Strait and the Chukchi Sea. The complete narrative of that place may remain forever hidden from us. Yet these well-known sunken territories are only part of the story. Across the entire planet, continental shelves that are submerged today stood exposed throughout the Ice Age. The Persian Gulf once lay entirely dry. This entire expanse, today spanning 300 miles in length with an average depth of 150 feet, was taken up by a river valley. The Tigris and Euphrates, which now empty separately into the Gulf, used to merge and flow as one mighty river system along the center of that valley, eventually reaching the Indian Ocean hundreds of miles south of where they meet the sea today. The implications for archaeology are immense. We already know that the earliest cities on Earth, such as Uruk and Ur, arose beside the Tigris and Euphrates, roughly 6,000 years ago. However, those cities sit close to today's shoreline. Could earlier towns, initial communities, have existed deeper in the valley now submerged? Might the genuine birthplace of Mesopotamian civilization lie buried beneath the Persian Gulf? A number of researchers believe exactly this. Sonar mapping of the Gulf seabed has revealed potential structural oddities, features that might represent ancient habitations. Yet digging into underwater sites at a depth of 150 feet, with murky waters and powerful currents, proves exceedingly challenging and costly. It is likely that most of these locations will never receive thorough examination. This same pattern unfolds virtually everywhere. The Grand Banks of Newfoundland, today celebrated as some of the most abundant fishing waters on Earth, formed a sizable island during the glacial era. Between Italy and Croatia, the whole Adriatic Sea was once an extensive coastal plain. The channel separating India from Sri Lanka stood as dry territory. What today is Hudson Bay in Canada was nowhere to be found. Instead, it was a low basin set within the immense Laurentide ice sheet. Every one of these vanished territories had particular qualities that drew human communities strongly. To begin with, they were level or softly undulating, simple to cross, and ideal for hunting. Additionally, they bordered the sea, offering both inland and ocean resources. Furthermore, they were nourished by great river networks that supplied drinking water and drew in wild prey. And in many cases, they enjoyed gentler climates than the frozen mountains nearby. Taken together, these conditions created landscapes capable of sustaining far denser human habitation than the unforgiving highlands of the Ice Age. Certain experts calculate that at the height of the last glaciation, at least half of all humans inhabited territory that lies beneath the sea today. If so, the bulk of our knowledge about Ice Age societies comes from evidence left by peripheral groups occupying less hospitable regions. We are looking at the communities of the highlands and inland valleys simply because those areas remain dry. But the true cultural hubs locations, with populations large enough to enable complex social structures and technological innovation, are entirely engulfed by water. And that's what makes it so maddening. Those coastal peoples were likely the most advanced civilizations of their era. Archaeology rests on the principle that close-knit populations fuel creativity. The more people gathered together, the greater the social contact, the freer the flow of ideas, and the more refined the division of labor. Tiny, far-flung bands may endure remarkably well, yet they will not become hubs of technological or cultural upheaval. Truly transformative moments occur among concentrated populations. Coastal hunter-gatherer communities of the modern era, such as the pre-contact tribes of the Pacific Northwest, built remarkably advanced civilizations. They established lasting towns, intricate class systems, rich artistic expressions, and ritual customs, all achieved without farming, purely through the bountiful gifts of the shoreline. We have no cause to think Ice Age shore dwellers couldn't have reached comparable sophistication, yet they've left us precious little to examine. The bulk of their possessions, wood, textiles, bone, and shell, breaks down swiftly beneath the waves. Only flint implements endure, and even those lie scattered, hidden under layers of silt. Any permanent constructions they might have raised were likely shattered by the flooding's fury or worn away by millennia of tides and coastline erosion. So now we're down to shards, tempting whispers of a far grander whole that has vanished. Once in a while, a fishing net hauls some relic from the North Sea, and sonar scans detect odd shapes below that could be buildings. Certainly, divers venture into flooded caverns and find cave paintings dating from when those chambers were dry. Still, these are mere fragments. It's like trying to reassemble a whole civilization from a handful of scattered jigsaw pieces without any idea of the final image. And then there's another thought that ought to unsettle you. We know the oceans climbed. We have a general idea of the timing and pace. But the fate of the coastal inhabitants when the waters advanced remains a mystery. Were they able to flee to higher ground? Might they have adjusted to the swelling ocean, shifting their homes inland season after season, century after century? Or did disaster strike all at once, massive deluges that swallowed whole lands within mere days or weeks? Geology tells us this was no steady, unhurried ascent. As the ice sheets retreated, the seas climbed in sudden surges. Huge ice barriers would collapse, dumping colossal amounts of glacier-fed meltwater into the ocean over an almost instantaneous span of geological time. Those leaps are visible in the evidence water levels rising several meters in merely 50 or 60 years. For anyone dwelling along those shores, such events would have spelled utter disaster. Picture yourself among a people of the coast. Your ancestors have inhabited this river valley for countless generations. You're familiar with every hunting trail, every fishing hole, every spring of drinking water and patch of wild food. The whole of your society and livelihood rests upon this land. Then, before your own eyes, the ocean pushes forward, not gradually, not tenderly, but through one brutal flood after another. The river's mouth, where for ages your kin have gathered mussels and clams, now lies beneath the waves. The flat coastal ground where you stalk deer is turning into salty marsh. Your villages and seasonal campsites, where everyone assembles, are steadily drowned by storm-driven waves. So what's the answer? Head inland, of course, yet relocation is no easy matter. The higher ground has been home to other tribes for just as long, and they have their own boundaries and their own rights to the land. All at once, you're a refugee driven by a changing environment you neither comprehend nor command. You find yourself scrambling for resources in areas already fully claimed by local inhabitants. The inevitable outcome: warfare. When people are uprooted on such a massive scale, clashes are unavoidable. Certain bands would broker deals, forging bonds or intermarrying with the Highlanders. Others would take up arms. Archaeology from the early Holocene, the age following the Ice Age, reveals a disturbing uptick in conflict. Bone fragments bearing spear points, hilltop fortresses, mass graves. That matches what we'd expect if huge numbers of shore folk were being pushed upslope by advancing waters. Yet the cultural toll may have cut even deeper than the loss of population. Whenever a community is uprooted, its expertise travels along. Through displacement, these people are also severed from the very terrain that shaped their wisdom. A shoreline tribe retreating to the hills brings along its netting methods, its canoe construction know-how, its grasp of ocean rhythms and sea life. But in their new surroundings, much of that understanding becomes useless. As the decades roll by, such cultural memory slowly dissolves. A few hundred years onward, the offspring of once advanced maritime peoples might lapse into simpler ways of living, simply because all they knew no longer applied. The great floodwaters claimed far more than solid ground. They submerged entire ways of life. Perhaps this explains the puzzling discoveries we keep unearthing. Civilizations that pop into the archaeological record unexpectedly, carrying tools and strange customs with no clear origin in the region. Could it be these are not brand new inventions? More likely, they're the broken fragments of coastal cultures, born into the interior by displaced survivors and passed down in whispers. The world that existed prior to the deluge might as well have been another planet. A planet with vast expanses of dry land, unfamiliar shorelines, altered weather systems. On that world, the prime spots for human life were the low-lying plains and river valleys now lost beneath the sea, places that once sustained multitudes we can scarcely envision, simply because we can scarcely explore them. Those peoples constitute a missing piece of our ancient past, a forgotten passage in humanity's saga. Within a few thousand years, as the glaciers completed their retreat and the ocean rose to its present line, they vanished entirely, swallowed, relocated, or scattered across the landscape. Beneath hundreds of feet of water and millennia of accumulated silt lay their homes. Only scattered echoes of their tales survived, carried within the great flood legends that countless civilizations would pass down through the ages. Yet even before they vanished entirely, before even the final expanse of those vast coastal lowlands slipped beneath the waves, another calamity still lay in store. The climate was poised to perform a feat that defied all expectation. It would render every earlier flood merely a foretaste, the true catastrophe. What was about to unfold would linger in humanity's collective recollection for millennia to come. Envision our world 12,900 years in the past. Following an extended period of gentle, consistent warming, the planet was stirring back to life. Glaciers that had mantled vast portions of North America and Europe for 100 millennia were at last withdrawing. Ocean levels climbed as melted fresh water streamed into the seas. Woodlands advanced northward, trailing the receding ice. Creatures were moving into regions that had lain imprisoned beneath ice for ages. Meanwhile, your forebears, heirs of those who endured the Ice Age, flourished. Human numbers surged, and communities along the shores grew ever more refined. Exchange routes stretched ever wider. Artifacts from this era reveal a steady rise in cultural intricacy, more expansive habitations, more finely crafted implements, and the earliest whispers of what could one day turn into farming. Life on Earth seemed to be improving. The long, bitter ordeal of the glacial epoch was drawing to a close, but abruptly, with no hint of what was coming, all progress halted and then turned backward. In a mere decade, perhaps even fewer years, temperatures across the northern half of the globe plunged dramatically. This was no slow, century-long drift. It was sudden and calamitous. Frozen mantles that had been shrinking for millennia lunged outward once more. Glaciers that had been wasting away started to expand. Waterways turned to ice. Lakes that had opened up with spring's embrace froze solid again. The prolonged warming that had come to define a whole epoch simply ceased. This brings us to the younger Dryas Earth's latest climate crisis, and among the most enigmatic occurrences in the planet's geological chronicle. And here is why it chills us to the bone. It defied all expectations. The glacial age was receding. Every condition that had held Earth within an icy grip for more than 100,000 years was now unwinding. Orbital rhythms were moving in a warmer direction. The ice albedo feedback had flipped, with darker terrain soaking up greater amounts of solar energy. By all projections, the planet ought to have gone on warming gently for millennia. But rather than doing so, it fell back into nearly glacial circumstances within just 10 years. To grasp that scale, suppose the present-day trend toward a hotter Earth were to shift course overnight. In a single decade, conditions had become cold enough to rival the Little Ice Age of the 17th century. That is the sheer magnitude and swiftness of the event 12 millennia ago. How do we know? Through ice cores extracted from the Greenland ice cap. Those cores preserve a frozen archive of our atmosphere stretching back many hundreds of millennia. Every individual stratum holds minuscule air bubbles, along with particles of dust, grains of pollen, and distinctive chemical markers. Such markers tell us what the climate was doing at the moment that snow first descended. And in the Greenland cores, researchers discovered something that ought to be impossible. Proxy records of ancient heat show that mean temperatures around the North Atlantic fell by roughly 15 degrees Celsius within a period of fewer than 10 years. That is anything but a slow cooling. It is a climate in collapse. This same precipitous chill appears in ice cores taken all over the northern half of the globe. From Europe to Asia to North America, all these continents felt the same sudden transformation at one and the same moment. Now, the mystery deepens. To this day, we cannot say with certainty what triggered it. Two great rival explanations exist, each disturbing in its own fashion. The first proposes a strike from beyond our world, and here is how that idea runs. Roughly 12,900 years back, our planet ran into the fragmented trail of a disintegrating comet. Several impacts struck North America, and perhaps Europe as well, with explosions both high in the sky and upon the ground, unleashing force comparable to countless nuclear warheads. Such collisions would have hurled enormous quantities of dust and rock into the air, dimming the sun and setting off swift refrigeration. They may also have ignited vast wildfires, whose lingering smoke would further cut down the solar energy arriving at the ground. This cosmic impact theory rests on evidence that is fiercely debated, yet fascinating. Scientists have uncovered, within a well-defined sediment stratum dating back 12,900 years, a collection of peculiar substances. Among them are microspherules, small glassy droplets born when rock fuses at intensely high heat. Also present are nanodiamonds, which can emerge from powerful collision events. And there are elevated amounts of platinum group metals, elements far more abundant in comets and asteroids than within our planet's own crust. A band of carbon-heavy material hints at fires raging across broad regions. Skeptics, however, contend that such materials can arise through ordinary earthly processes, with no impact required. Vast forest blazes leave behind comparable remnants, and volcanic eruptions can gather platinum group metals into richer deposits. The debate goes on, with fresh studies every so often adding weight to or questioning the impact theory. But there's another idea, one that requires no cosmic involvement whatsoever. And in certain ways, it's even more unsettling, because it hints that Earth's climate system can shift entirely on its own into a catastrophic cold phase without any external push. This idea centers on what's called the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. Picture a vast oceanic conveyor belt that moves warm equatorial water up to the North Atlantic and then carries colder water back southward through the deep. This current system is absolutely essential for keeping Europe and North America fairly mild. If it were to stop, those places would get much colder, even though they're located at relatively temperate latitudes. The way it works is simple. Warm, salty water moves north along the surface. When it meets the icy waters of the North Atlantic, it cools off and becomes heavier. Cold, salty water is denser than warm, fresh water, so it sinks all the way to the seafloor. That sinking produces a pulling effect that draws more warm water north, keeping the loop in motion. It's a self-sustaining cycle that has existed for millions of years. But there's a catch. This system is easily disturbed by fresh water. Dump enormous quantities of fresh water into the North Atlantic, and it thins down the salty ocean, lowering its density. If the surface water loses its ability to sink, the entire circulation can come to a halt. And when that conveyor stops, the northern hemisphere turns to ice. Now think back to what was happening 12,900 years ago. The Ice Age was drawing to a close, and huge ice sheets were beginning to thaw. Meltwater was rushing into the seas. But most of it was going to the Pacific, or flowing south through the Mississippi, or taking other routes that didn't disturb the Atlantic circulation. As long as meltwater entered the ocean little by little and didn't pile up in the North Atlantic, things stayed stable. Yet the ice sheets covering North America were no ordinary glaciers. They made up the largest mass of ice anywhere outside Antarctica. In places they were over 2 miles thick. As they melted, enormous lakes formed along their edges, trapped behind ice dams and ridges of glacial rubble. These weren't typical lakes. They were inland seas, holding more water than all of today's Great Lakes merged together. The largest was Lake Agassiz, named after the scientist who first argued that ice ages had occurred. At its greatest extent, this lake stretched over an area bigger than any current freshwater lake on Earth, reaching from Saskatchewan to Ontario and from North Dakota into Minnesota. In certain spots, it was more than 200 meters deep, and the only things preventing it from reaching the ocean were ice barriers and piles of glacial sediment. As the climate warmed, those ice barriers grew weaker. For thousands of years they managed to hold on, sometimes letting go of a flood, but staying essentially whole. The meltwater discovered southern routes, flowing through the Mississippi River system and into the Gulf of Mexico. Then, around 12,900 years ago, something shifted. Either an impact event weakened the ice dams, or they simply reached a breaking point where they could no longer withstand the pressure. All at once, and with devastating suddenness, Lake Agassiz's eastern outlets burst open. Trillions of gallons of fresh water didn't head for the Gulf of Mexico. Instead, they streamed into the North Atlantic through the St. Lawrence River system. The sheer volume is difficult to grasp. Some estimates suggest the discharge was equal to about 50 Amazon rivers flowing simultaneously for several years. This wasn't a mere flood. It was an event that drained water on a planetary scale. All that fresh water unfolded across the North Atlantic, floating above the heavy salt water and forming a cap that blocked the normal ocean currents. With no cold water sinking to power the engine, the Atlantic conveyor ground to a halt. Warm water no longer flowed northward. The climate of the northern hemisphere, which depended on that heat being carried along, spiraled into near ice age conditions within a decade. That's the meltwater pulse theory. And unlike the impact hypothesis, we have definite proof that these meltwater events really took place. The geological evidence is impossible to ignore. Massive floods definitely occurred. Lake Agassiz drained catastrophically multiple times, and the route of meltwater did shift around 12,900 years ago. What's still uncertain is whether this was the main reason for the younger Dryas cooling, or if an impact event caused the drainage to happen. Honestly, both theories might be partly right. Maybe an impact triggered the initial drop in temperature, while also destabilizing ice dams that were already growing fragile. Perhaps the sudden, catastrophic drainage of Lake Agassiz then kept the cooling going and intensified it, amplifying whatever effects the impacts had started. The two ideas don't have to cancel each other out. But here's what we can be completely sure of. When the younger Dryas began, it didn't simply make the world colder. It brought about wildly unstable climate conditions that endured for 1,300 years. Ice core temperature records show rapid swings within that overall cold phase. Temperatures would fall, then warm for a little while, then fall again. Precipitation patterns transformed too, with certain regions suffering extreme droughts while others were hit with much heavier rain or snow. The ice sheets reacted to these shifts, but not everywhere in the same way. In some places, glaciers lunged forward, pushing ahead many kilometers each year and crushing whatever lay in their path. Elsewhere, the intricate interplay between glacial movement and meltwater produced a precarious situation, causing ice masses to advance and recede in endless cycles. Above all for this tale, the younger Dryas left the entire planet poised with immense pent-up energy. Enormous ice sheets sat in precarious arrangements. Vast meltwater lakes, restrained by ever-weakening barriers of ice, held sufficient water to lift seas worldwide by several meters. Meanwhile, permafrost, kept frozen by the persistent chill, preserved the firmness of enormous territories. Every element, along with human communities, was balanced on the edge of a blade. These human populations, which had been growing and building more intricate societies during the warmer era, suddenly confronted a climatic disaster. The physical evidence left from this era reveals profound shifts in culture. Certain communities were left empty. Others display indications of hardship. Dwindling numbers, cruder implements, and long-distance exchange routes that had once flourished abruptly shrank. Yet humanity did not vanish. Instead, they adjusted and endured, much as their predecessors had weathered the first Great Freeze. They found methods to manage the returning chill, relocated their homes, altered how they obtained food, invented fresh tools, and carried on for 13 centuries. They suffered through circumstances that swung erratically between dreadful and even more dreadful, with brief interludes of mere hardship. Groups that had begun to farm reverted to foraging and hunting. Shoreline villages relocated in pursuit of the shifting coasts. Peoples of the north journeyed towards warmer southern lands. Communities in the south grew accustomed to chillier and more parched surroundings. Then, approximately 11,600 years ago, the situation transformed once more. The younger Dryas drew to a close, yet not in the slow manner in which it had arrived. Its ending was violently sudden. Ancient climate records indicate a temperature climb of roughly 10 degrees Celsius within a span of fewer than 10 years. In certain places, the transformation could have been even quicker, perhaps a mere 3 to 5 years. The glaciers that had expanded during the younger Dryas now melted at speeds never seen before, nothing like the unhurried, gradual thaw of an ordinary ice age retreat. A catastrophic thaw swept across the world, leaving the glaciers that had once marched forward marooned in balmy regions. They liquefied simultaneously from underneath, from their surfaces, and along their edges. Huge ice fields fractured into pieces, enormous stretches vanishing in just a few years. Those ice barriers, reinforced over 13 centuries of chill and containing ever-expanding glacial lakes, now confronted rising warmth. The bodies of water, which had swollen throughout the cold epoch, stood completely brimming as fresh melt poured in. The dams, losing strength by the day under the abrupt heat, hovered on the edge of collapse, and their collapse would not be a hesitant, slow process. When ice dams give way, there is no gradual wearing away. They burst apart destructively, unleashing their full contents within a matter of days or weeks. Lake Agassiz, on its own, having filled again during the younger Dryas, held enough water to increase ocean levels by half a meter, and countless other glacial lakes scattered across North America, Europe, and Asia contained enormous amounts more. Over the following 5 to 10 decades, these barriers gave way one by one, sending forth torrents so immense that today's worst river floods would seem like insignificant little pools. The rate of water discharge was greater than the combined flow of every river now on the planet. Towering walls of water, hundreds of feet high, surged over the terrain. Coastlines that had remained unchanged for more than 1,000 years were overwhelmed within just a few years, moving at speeds that offered no chance of escape. However, we are racing too far ahead. There will be time to examine those floods more closely in the following chapter. For the moment, it is enough to grasp what the younger Dryas accomplished. It was far more than a mere chilly interval. It served as a stress test for the entire climate system, charging the world's terrain with the capacity for devastation. It arranged ice into fragile shapes, destined to crumble dramatically upon the return of warmth. It trapped enormous lakes behind softening barriers. It expanded the reaches of permafrost and subterranean ice, which would lose their stability as soon as heat returned. It prepared the scene for the swiftest rise of ocean levels in the last 20,000 years. And this all transpired while people occupied coastal regions that were soon to be wiped from the map. The younger Dryas laid the groundwork. Subsequent warming acted as the fuse for disaster, and the shore-dwelling societies that had endured the earlier freeze had absolutely no inkling of what was approaching. You see, those inhabitants of the shorelines had grown accustomed to 13 centuries of chill, a fairly dependable period. The weather certainly wavered now and then, yet throughout the younger Dryas the sea stood at remarkably consistent heights. The coastlines they inhabited had served as the same shore for dozens of generations. To the best of their knowledge, extending back through their grandparents' memories, and even deep into their spoken legends, the ocean had forever occupied that exact spot. They erected lasting villages and honed skills for traveling the seas. They wove commercial connections that bound seaside settlements together over thousands of kilometers. They gathered wisdom concerning tides, seasonal cycles, the paths of fish, and the location of shellfish beds. Their children grew up knowing no other existence than that of the coastline, and the possibility that the globe might transform with such blinding speed was entirely beyond their imagination. They had no awareness of glaciers, meltwater reservoirs, or critical thresholds in the climate, and there was no method by which they might foresee what lay ahead. All they knew was that the air was growing milder, which, following 13 centuries of cold, likely felt like a blessing. And then, the floods arrived. They did not arrive slowly. Instead, they struck in a sequence of devastating surges, redrawing the world's shorelines and wiping whole cultures off the map. However, that chapter lies ahead. For now, Let's focus on the precise mechanics of those floods, where the water originated, and its sheer volume. What follows will make the younger Dryas seem merely a prelude to the grand catastrophe. Roughly 11,600 years ago, an event unfolded that permanently altered the planet's countenance. It wasn't sudden, nor was it visible in a single lifetime. Rather, it was a gradual, unrelenting advance, with the seas climbing higher season after season. This wasn't the gentle, predictable creep one might picture, not the kind of patient shift that earlier generations could counter by simply settling a bit farther up the shore. This was a different beast altogether, swifter and far more destructive, eventually devouring millions of square kilometers of terrain and all that rested upon it. Researchers have dubbed it Meltwater Pulse 1b, arguably the dullest label ever assigned to a catastrophe of such magnitude. Let's unpack that sterile phrase. Between roughly 11,600 and 11,300 years ago, ocean heights climbed somewhere in the range of 15 to 28 meters. For those measuring in imperial units, that equates to about 50 to 90 feet within 3 centuries, or perhaps even less time. One might think, all right, 15 to 28 meters spread across 300 years means merely 5 to 9 centimeters each year. That hardly sounds alarming. People could simply relocate, couldn't they? Yet reality was far more complex. Floodwaters never advance evenly. They don't obligingly climb a neat 5 centimeters every New Year's Day, allowing communities ample opportunity to shift their homes a short distance inland. Instead, water arrives in waves, accompanying storms during spring tides, and with seasonal thaws that can lift the ocean several meters in just a handful of days, and that elevated watermark stands forever as the new shoreline. Picture yourself in a seaside settlement, 11,600 years ago. Your ancestors have occupied this ground for generations, perhaps for centuries. Every fishing hole, every clam bed, every freshwater source is familiar to you. You know the paths of game, the nesting grounds of migratory birds, and the densest patches of edible vegetation. Then, in a particular spring, the sea fails to pull back as far as it customarily did once winter storms had passed. The familiar beach appears narrower. Several tide pools you had gathered from since youth now lie perpetually submerged. You might chalk it up to an odd season. Weather patterns do shift. The following year will surely be better, except it proves worse, and the year after that is worse still. In 10 years, the revered cavern where generations performed sacred rituals is overtaken by high tides. Within 20 years, the entire lower hamlet, home to the most skilled fishermen, must be deserted. Previously, pure freshwater springs have turned briny, tainted by invading saltwater. The shellfish beds now lie beyond reach beneath the depths. Yet the ocean continues its advance. Within half a century, every landmark your grandparents recognized is submerged. The scenery of your youth has vanished, and your displacement is not a single event. Again and again, every few years, you are forced to relocate, leaving behind homes, resources, and hallowed grounds, pressing deeper into lands that are already claimed by others' peoples, far from welcoming of refugees who arrive seeking finite supplies. This relentless cycle lasted 3 centuries. That equates to 10 generations of perpetual withdrawal, 10 generations witnessing the planet's drowning. Such was the harsh reality of Meltwater Pulse 1b for those who endured it. Now, what triggered this catastrophe? Why did the seas abruptly choose to consume such an expanse of land in so brief a time? The cause is actually fairly clear, even if the magnitude is nearly beyond grasp. 2 enormous ice sheets, which had reigned over the northern hemisphere for 100 millennia, grew unstable and started to crumble into the ocean. They didn't vanish entirely or in a single moment, yet their disintegration was swift and vast enough to pour tens of trillions of metric tons of meltwater into the global seas over the course of a few hundred years. The primary offender was the Laurentide ice sheet, a colossal glacial dome that had blanketed the majority of Canada and the northern United States during the final glacial maximum. At its apogee, it reached more than 3 kilometers in thickness in certain spots. 3 kilometers of solid ice bore down on the Earth's crust so heavily that it compressed the land below. Still, by 11,000, 600 years ago, the Laurentide was faltering. A colder, drier climatic snap the younger Dryas had briefly held it steady. Yet once that era drew to a close and warmth crept back in, the great ice sheet began to fall apart in dramatic fashion. Its southern edges were the first to soften, giving rise to vast proglacial lakes, vast pools of meltwater held between the shrinking ice and the ground. A few of these bodies of water were larger than all of today's Great Lakes put together, yet they were anything but steady. Whenever the ice walls gave way, and they gave way again and again, these lakes could empty within weeks or a few months, unleashing staggering quantities of fresh water into the sea. These were floods that would reduce the Mississippi to a mere stream by comparison. Meltwater rivers stretched for kilometers, bearing icebergs as large as houses, and they drew down the lakes by perhaps tens of meters in the span of a very short time. Of course, all that water needed a destination, and it found its way into the Atlantic, lifting global seas, throwing ocean currents off balance, and overwhelming shorelines from Newfoundland down to the Caribbean. Yet the Laurentide ice wasn't working in isolation. On the far side of the Earth, Antarctica was confronting its own turmoil. The great ice sheet of West Antarctica, which had remained quiet throughout most of the glacial epoch, started to undergo a process that glaciologists refer to as marine ice sheet instability. This is a particularly destructive kind of ice sheet disintegration, triggered when ice anchored to the seafloor begins to pull back. The trouble lies beneath the surface. A large portion of West Antarctica rests on bedrock that lies, in fact, below the ocean's surface. As long as the ice remained thick and frigid, it stayed steady. But once temperatures climbed and the edges started to lose thickness, ocean water could slip in below. Seawater, after all, has a far greater capacity to melt ice than air ever could. The moment seawater sneaks beneath an ice sheet, it starts dissolving the ice from underneath, setting off a self-reinforcing cycle. The ice grows thinner, allowing more water to flood in, which causes even more melting from below, and the ice continues to thin. In time, whole expanses of the ice sheet can simply lift away from their rocky base and tumble into the sea. This is exactly what seems to have occurred roughly 11,600 years ago. Vast swaths of West Antarctica's ice lost their grip on the seafloor and slowly drifted into the Southern Ocean. Multiple lines of evidence point to this event. Cores pulled from the seabed surrounding Antarctica reveal enormous layers of ice-rafted debris, rocks, and stones that could have only been carried by icebergs at precisely that time in history. The scale and spread of these deposits imply something far more violent than ordinary iceberg calving episodes of catastrophic release, with massive pieces of Antarctic ice shearing off and drifting away. Around the same time, coral reefs were recording the very same tale from an entirely different vantage point. Corals prove remarkably valuable for piecing together ancient sea levels, since they live right at the ocean's surface. As the water climbs, they can stretch upward to stay near the light. Yet there is a limit to how quickly they can grow. If the sea climbs too swiftly, the coral is submerged too deeply, unable to photosynthesize, and ultimately perishes. When sea level climbs gradually, the coral builds at a matching pace, leaving an unbroken chronicle behind. By extracting cores from old reefs and analyzing the age of each stratum, researchers can pin down precisely the speed at which seas were climbing. What the coral record shows from 11,600 years ago is nothing short of remarkable. Reefs scattered across the Caribbean, the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean all follow an identical pattern. Coral flourishes until approximately 11,600 years ago, and then comes a sudden interruption. Many sites display what scientists call a give-up reef, where the organisms were no longer able to keep pace with the climbing waters. They perished precisely where they stood, forever captured as a frozen image of an environmental upheaval. With such precise dating, the pulsing rhythm of the flood becomes visible. This was no gentle, steady ascent of the sea. Instead, the water rose in abrupt pulses, phases of extraordinarily fast sea-level climb separated by calmer periods or even brief stasis. The implication is that the collapse of the ice sheets was never a gradual process. It unfolded as a series of separate occurrences, each likely set off by its own particular trigger. Here, an ice dam would crack. There, a stretch of marine ice would break loose, and sail away. Every one of these events poured vast quantities of water into the sea within a very brief window, followed by a lull while things settled again before the next rupture. During the fiercest moments of Meltwater Pulse 1b, sea levels climbed at truly incredible speed. Modern studies indicate that in certain intervals the maximum rate may have touched 40 to 50 millimeters each year. That figure 4 to 5 centimeters annually might seem trivial at first glance. Yet, keep in mind, this was not happening on the open ocean. It was on shores with extraordinarily gentle slopes. These are the low-lying coastal flatlands where ancient communities tended to gather. If the shore slopes at just 1 meter per thousand common for numerous river deltas and coastal plains, a 50-millimeter rise in sea level means losing 50 meters of land every year, and this went on for decades. For certain groups dwelling on exceptionally level coastal ground, this forced them to leave their homes behind and retreat hundreds of meters further inland, repeating the move every few years simply to outrun the encroaching sea. Yet the situation becomes even more dire. The flood was not the same all around the world. The pace at which various shorelines were flooded varied enormously, shaped by regional terrain, tectonic shifts, and a phenomenon known as glacial isostatic adjustment. Put simply, this term describes how the Earth's crust rises and sinks in reaction to the sheer load of ice sheets. Picture 3 kilometers of ice pressing down on North America for 100 millennia. The ground beneath it gradually subsides under that immense weight. At the same time, the ice-free zones near the sheet's edges gently lift, forming a bulge as the mantle's soft rock shifts away from the compressed heartland. Once the ice thaws, everything flips. Those lands that were once buried under ice start to lift again, a rebound known as post-glacial uplift, while the former bulges along the edges gradually subside. This movement persists even now. Portions of Canada climb by several millimeters annually, even as parts of the eastern U.S. descend. Yet 11.5 millennia ago, this rebound was far more vigorous, and it dramatically reshaped relative sea levels. For anyone dwelling in formerly glaciated zones, say, around Hudson Bay, the ocean could appear to drop, even while global waters were climbing. At first, the bedrock was springing upward quicker than the sea could swell. But in the bulge regions such as North America's mid-Atlantic shore or much of Southeast Asia communities faced a double blow. The ocean was climbing from melted ice, while their own ground was falling as the bulge flattened. The two forces together could be ruinous. In certain areas, sea level climbed an effective 5 to 10 meters per century, 20 times swifter than today's rise. Because of such regional differences, some coastal groups may have had decades to adjust, while others faced sudden, overwhelming inundation. The scant archaeological remains echo this uneven story. Some sites show a slow, decades-long exodus, as resources dwindled and people drifted away. Others reveal the unmistakable signs of a hasty departure. At such places, belongings and provisions were simply left behind. The pace of local coastal flooding likely dictated whether people could plan an orderly retreat. The sediments of submerged river valleys offer the same message. Long before Meltwater Pulse 1b, during the younger Dryas, rivers had carved deep channels in response to much lower seas. These waterways ran through their valleys toward the ocean, producing quiet floodplains and wide deltas ideal for human habitation. Then, as the seas climbed quickly, the salt water pushed inland from the river mouths, invading what were once purely freshwater environments. Estuaries crept further inland. The same deltas that had drawn settlers with their bounty gradually disappeared beneath the waves. Core samples pulled from these sunken valleys reveal abrupt shifts in both sediment layers and living communities over remarkably brief intervals. Suddenly, saltwater organisms took the place of freshwater ones, and marine clays blanketed what had been river mud. In many cores, these changes span layers that accumulated over only a matter of decades, clear evidence that the environment transformed far too quickly for species to adapt step by step. And if the fish and mollusks could not keep up, what hope was there for people? By the close of Meltwater Pulse 1b, roughly 11,300 years ago, the world's geography had been completely redrawn. The amount of land swallowed by the sea is nearly beyond imagining. The Gulf of Mexico swelled enormously, burying vast stretches of former coastal plain. The Persian Gulf, which had been almost entirely dry land during the Ice Age, became a deep marine basin. Sundaland, the ancient subcontinent linking Southeast Asia to Indonesia, shrank to a scattering of islands. The English Channel broadened until Britain was unmistakably an island. Across every continent, shorelines had retreated inland by tens of kilometers, sometimes by hundreds. Yet the rising waters did not cease entirely. Once Meltwater Pulse 1b came to an end. The great ice sheets kept shedding meltwater, albeit far more slowly, for millennia. Further pulse events followed, lesser in scale, but still consequential. Around 8,200 years ago, the 8.2 kiloamperes event brought another sudden surge of meltwater, this time as glacial Lake Agassiz in North America drained for good. Once the final ice barrier gave way, the lake emptied with catastrophic force into Hudson Bay and then spilled into the North Atlantic. Such an enormous rush of freshwater disrupted ocean currents, triggering a short but sharp chill that hit the North Atlantic especially hard. Global sea levels jumped another 1 to 4 meters in a short span, reflooding coasts that had felt secure. But by then, people had learned bitter lessons about living beside the sea. Settlement remains from these later times reveal far more cautious siting choices. Houses went up farther from the shore, on higher elevations, with fast inland exits close at hand. The shadows of earlier floods lived on in stories, legends, and hard-won practical wisdom. These coastal communities had been climate refugees, and they did not forget. Today, the geological proof of these catastrophes is beyond dispute. Core samples taken from continental shelves around the globe all bear the telltale marks of sudden marine transgression. Corals supply exact dates and speeds. Glacial landforms indicate precisely when the ice sheets broke apart, and the chemistry of seafloor mud captures the enormous freshwater influx. Every line of evidence leads back to one verdict, from about 11,600 to 11,300 years ago, with smaller episodes stretching on for thousands of years more. The planet suffered sea level rise at speeds unmatched in all of recorded history. For those living along the coasts, it was an apocalypse, unfolding one slow, relentless step at a time. This wasn't one sudden catastrophe, no volcanic blast or tremor of the earth. Instead, it was a slow, unyielding shift that turned entire regions into places where no one could live, pushing whole populations to move on. And here lies the truly unsettling part. The great ice sheets that gave way during Meltwater Pulse 1b were not being subjected to anything nearly as intense as the warming we are causing today. That warming was a natural phenomenon, set in motion by the slow rhythm of Earth's orbital shifts and self-reinforcing feedback loops. In fact, temperatures climbed at a pace more gradual than what we're experiencing right now. Even so, it proved powerful enough to shake the stability of ice sheets, spanning entire continents, and unleash floods of almost unimaginable scale. But today, our warming is happening far more quickly, and both Greenland and Antarctica are beginning to display the very same kinds of instability that came before Meltwater Pulse 1b. West Antarctica's marine ice sheets are already showing signs of collapse. Greenland, too, is shedding ice at an accelerating pace. These are precisely the kinds of warning signals we ought to take seriously. Our forebears did live through Meltwater Pulse 1b, but the price they paid was immense. They lost their dwellings, their means of sustenance, their holy sites, and the lands their ancestors had walked for generations. They were turned into refugees within a world that was already crowded with other people, struggling for the same limited resources. And they had no modern tools, no worldwide networks, no global alliances to ease their adaptation. We, on the other hand, have all of these. So the real question becomes, will we make the most of these advantages, or will we leave our descendants telling flood legends about us? Tales of a second great deluge, a time when people once more looked on as the waters climbed and saw the world they recognized slip away forever. That brings us to the uneasy question that mainstream archaeology avoided for decades. If countless millions once made their homes along shorelines that now rest beneath the waves, where is the proof? That proof has to be there. This isn't a matter of a handful of isolated campsites. We're speaking of whole civilizations, hundreds of generations of human life strung across thousands of miles of coast. When those lands sank beneath the sea 11,600 years ago, they did not simply vanish. They were submerged. Every structure they raised, every object they left behind, still lies down there, resting on the continental shelf beneath 300 feet of ocean. The trouble was that nobody thought to go looking. Through the greater part of the 20th century, archaeologists worked from one basic premise. True civilization, they believed, emerged only some 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Whatever came before that was the work of simple hunter-gatherers, people who raised no lasting buildings and created no intricate societies. Under that assumption, why would anyone waste time searching beneath the sea for something that was never supposed to be there? Then, in 1984, a marine archaeologist named Ehud Galilei was mapping the ocean floor off Israel's coast when he came across something that simply shouldn't have existed. Stony structures, not natural rock formations, but unmistakable man-made walls, buildings, and even a well carved from stone. All of it lay 26 feet beneath the water, roughly 1,300 feet from the present-day coastline. This site was at Lit Yam, and it altered everything. Galilei had uncovered a complete Neolithic village, beautifully kept within the Mediterranean sediments. Homes with stone foundations lined recognizable streets. Hearths still held their ash. Stone implements lay precisely where they had fallen. Most striking of all, the village featured a stone well that reached down through the waterlogged, salt-saturated layers until it met the freshwater aquifers hidden below. That is not the work of primitive hands. It's smart, careful engineering by people who clearly grasped the behavior of water and the structure of the earth. When organic remains from the village were radiocarbon dated, the results placed the settlement somewhere between 8,900 and 8,300 years ago. At the time of its construction, the village stood on dry ground, for the seas had not yet climbed. But as the last great pulses of meltwater lifted the Mediterranean, the residents left their houses behind and retreated to higher land. The ocean surged inward, heaping sediment over everything, and sealed the site for 8 millennia like a capsule from another age. Yet what made Lit Yam truly important was this. The dates indicated the village was deserted right as the meltwater pulses were winding down. That means its builders and inhabitants lived through the very flooding that swallowed the coasts. They witnessed, with their own eyes, the gradual drowning of their world. They were forced to decide to walk away from everything they had created and find safety on higher ground. This was no abstract idea. It was genuine human beings losing their homes to advancing waters. And Lit Yam was far from the only example. As soon as archaeologists began genuinely searching underwater, they came across settlements in great numbers. Near the southern coast of Greece, investigators found Pavlopetri, a whole Bronze Age town resting 13 feet beneath the surface. Its streets were arranged in a methodical grid. Foundation walls were still easy to make out, along with a central square and what looks like an intricate arrangement of channels for managing water. The entire site spans roughly 123,000 square feet and dates back some 5,000 years, which makes it among the oldest sunken towns ever found. Still, these were comparatively recent places, communities established after ocean levels had more or less settled. But the far more intriguing question concerned the earlier coastlines, those that were inundated during the great meltwater pulses between 14,000 and 11,600 years ago. What had become of the settlements that stood upon them then? It is at precisely this point that the tale begins to stir debate. For when you begin to investigate the truly deep underwater locations, those resting on the continental shelf 200 to 400 feet below the surface, you begin to discover objects that refuse to match the accepted chronology. Objects hinting that human civilizations were considerably more sophisticated and far older than most people were willing to accept. Consider the formations discovered off the shore of Gujarat, India. In 2001, marine researchers employing sonar to check pollution in the Gulf of Cambay picked up geometric shapes on the ocean bed at a depth of around 120 feet. Subsequent examinations brought to light what seemed to be enormous stone formations, foundational remains, and even a possible network of streets resembling a city grid spreading across multiple square miles. In response, India's National Institute of Ocean Technology was mobilized. Underwater robotic vehicles were used to gather specimens, and they retrieved shards of pottery, carved wooden pieces, and shaped stone implements. Radiocarbon analysis performed on certain organic remnants yielded dates around 9,500 years ago. Additional specimens appeared to be far older, some reaching 31,000 years, but these results are fiercely debated. Almost at once, the location stirred up significant scientific disagreement. Should the formations truly be man-made and the age estimates correct, that would place an advanced society in India millennia before Mesopotamia's oldest documented cities. Skeptics countered that the shapes could have formed naturally, or that the dating samples were compromised. The argument remains unresolved, yet everyone agrees the seafloor there contains remarkable oddities worth further study. The real obstacle is that underwater archaeology is enormously challenging and prohibitively costly. On dry land, you can scan wide territories by eye, employ ground-penetrating radar, and dig at sites with relative ease. Beneath the waves, however, visibility may be limited to a few feet rather than miles. Strong currents and shifting sediment gradually cover any structures. The necessary tools, submersibles, remotely operated vehicles, and advanced diving equipment run into the millions. And the further down you venture, the more difficult and costly each operation grows. Because of all this, we have only begun to explore what lies beneath. During the Ice Age, continental shelves that are now underwater made up roughly 8 million square miles of dry terrain. By today's estimates, less than 1% of these flooded regions have been examined archaeologically. In essence, we are hunting for signs of vanished cultures, as if blindfolded and with one hand tied behind our backs. Yet the technology keeps advancing. Contemporary sonar mapping is capable of producing astonishingly precise pictures of the ocean bottom. Side-scan sonar is able to pick out objects just a few inches in size. Multi-beam bathymetry swiftly charts enormous expanses, revealing ocean floor terrain with impressive clarity. Meanwhile, remotely operated vehicles fitted with high-definition cameras are able to investigate locations far beyond the reach of human divers. The moment scientists apply these tools in a methodical way, discoveries keep emerging. Not far from the Japanese island of Yonaguni, local divers came across what could be the planet's most disputed submerged formation. Known as the Yonaguni Monument, this huge rock feature bears an uncanny resemblance to a terraced pyramid, with what seem to be sculpted steps, vertical walls joining at perfect right angles, and certain details that some experts read as pathways and engraved markings. The formation rests anywhere from 16 to 80 feet beneath the surface. Were it situated on solid ground, few would doubt its human origin. But as it lies underwater, and as acknowledging it as man-made would demand a complete redrawing of Japan's prehistoric timeline, it has sparked heated controversy ever since it was found in 1986. Marine geologist Masaki Kamira, a professor emeritus at the University of the Ryukyu, has devoted many years to investigating the site. He contends that although the underlying rock is natural sandstone, it was deliberately altered and shaped by human activity. He highlights markings that look like cuts from instruments, evidence of what seems to be quarrying, and a geometric exactness in certain angles and borders seldom seen in unmodified rock. Doubters, among them geologist Robert Shaw, who personally studied the spot, maintain that everything is fully natural, produced by seismic forces and weathering along cracks already present in the sandstone. Their claim is that human beings tend to perceive patterns everywhere, even in arbitrary natural shapes, and that the Yonaguni Monument is simply a case of pareidolia seeing design where nothing of the sort exists. Yet there is one matter on which both sides wholeheartedly concur. The formation, whether nature's work or human construction, stood above the sea during the last ice age. 12,000 years ago, the ocean's surface in that area sat 130 feet lower than it does now. The Yonaguni Monument therefore occupied solid ground precisely at the moment when the great meltwater pulses were submerging shorelines across the globe. If any human hand did shape it, that work would have occurred prior to those rising waters. Even if the structure is entirely natural, any indications of people would still place them there before the site went underwater. Whichever interpretation holds true, The evidence suggests human occupation of coastal zones that now lie beneath the waves, precisely during the era those zones were flooded. The identical story is repeated in another part of the world, off the coast of Cuba. In 2001, sonar scans uncovered what looked like consistent geometric arrangements. Those shapes lay at a depth of approximately 2,000 feet. The imagery displayed balanced stone formations spanning an area comparable to a city block. Later exploration revealed still more strange features. However, the tremendous depth rendered thorough investigation all but impossible with the equipment on hand. Is it a geological formation or the remains of a sunken city? No one can say with certainty. And close to Bimini in the Bahamas, divers have recorded what may be a stone causeway or wall. This feature is made up of enormous limestone slabs laid out in an astonishingly straight alignment stretching roughly 2,000 feet. Known as the Bimini Road, it has been carefully studied by geologists. Their conclusion is that it amounts to literal rock, a natural structure created when coastal sediment fuses together. Yet the consistent distances between the blocks and what look like quarry marks on certain stones ensure the debate lives on. That's the key point when it comes to these disputed places. They remain disputed for one simple reason: we possess so little information. Neither side can conclusively demonstrate that they are human-made, nor can anyone conclusively prove they are natural. Ultimately, these disagreements continue because we simply lack the funding and equipment to carry out comprehensive, systematic underwater surveys of these locations. Ideally, we'd carry out a full, methodical charting of every inch of the continental shelf, then carefully examine anything that seems out of place. That kind of effort would demand billions of dollars and many years. But because that's not practical, all we end up with are scattered surveys, quick looks here and there, and never-ending debates over unclear sonar readings and single diving accounts. At the same time, findings that rarely spark debate continue to grow. These are quieter clues, less flashy, and therefore much harder to challenge, yet they are undeniably human in origin. Across the globe, submerged cave systems hold unmistakable signs that people dwelled inside them while those caves still sat above the waves. Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula is honeycombed with underwater caves, yet these passageways were completely dry during the Ice Age. Cave divers have discovered human bones here. Among them, the 13,000-year-old remains of an adolescent girl they came to call Nia. Stone implements, ancient hearths, and other objects of human craft have turned up as well. The rising seas didn't flood these caverns directly. Instead, they filled when the water table climbed higher as the great ice sheets melted. Yet these caves prove that humans occupied regions now hidden beneath the sea, places we would never imagine searching if we focused only on dry ground. Consider the North Sea. During the Ice Age, the entire stretch between Britain and mainland Europe lay dry and open. A sprawling lowland, known as Dogland, once linked England to Holland, Germany, and Denmark. Far from being a forgotten fringe, this was some of the best land around, filled with rivers, lakes, and plentiful wildlife, and it must have supported tens of thousands of inhabitants. Then the oceans swelled, and the whole landscape vanished beneath the waves. Even now, fishing boats sometimes haul up Stone Age implements, pieces of bone, and intricately carved objects from the bottom of the North Sea. Every artifact serves as a quiet reminder that a whole world of human history is hidden beneath today's busy shipping routes. Just off Denmark's coast, marine archaeologists have found sunken forests with ancient oaks and pines still standing exactly where they sprouted 10 millennia ago, now submerged under 30 feet of salt water. In among the preserved stumps, divers have uncovered stone tools and animal bones bearing telltale cut marks, a strong sign that people once hunted and prepared meat in these woodlands while they stood on a dry coastal plain. Within the Baltic lie numerous sunken villages, Stone Age fishing camps and hunting grounds that once lined lake shores and coasts when ocean levels stood far lower. Sonar surveys have brought to light untouched landscape details, old river courses, old lake bottoms, and what look like fish traps built from stone, all resting beneath the water today. All these finds keep pointing to one fundamental fact. Enormous stretches of the continental shelf were home to people during the Ice Age, and when those lands became submerged, the traces of that habitation were sealed beneath the sea. It's only now that we're starting to uncover them, simply because we've only just started looking in earnest. A high-tech revolution in undersea exploration is showing us how much we've overlooked. Today's sonar systems can render the ocean floor with a clarity to rival aerial photos taken on land, and robotic underwater vehicles are now able to cover vast swaths as well. These regions are simply too expansive for divers to explore by hand. Meanwhile, machine learning algorithms can comb through sonar data and automatically flag likely archaeological sites. As these tools become more affordable and widespread, discoveries are being made faster than ever. Over the last 10 years alone, marine researchers have located thousands of shipwrecks that were never documented before, plus hundreds of ancient settlements lying below the surface. Every new scan uncovers things that raise fresh questions and call for further study. Yet a maddening truth remains. For each location we actually explore, there may well be hundreds more still waiting to be discovered. The continental shelf is simply immense, and the very places most likely to have hosted sizable communities, river mouths, natural harbors, and bountiful shorelines are exactly where river-borne sediment has piled the deepest during the past 11 millennia. Locating any structures beneath 300 feet of ocean is difficult in itself. But when those same structures lie under 300 feet of water and then 50 additional feet of mud, it becomes almost unthinkable unless you have extremely costly deep scanning sonar and drilling operations. That's the reason arguments over lost civilizations are still up in the air. Not because proof is missing, but because it lies under the ocean, hidden below layers of silt spread over millions of square miles of seafloor we've barely begun to map. It's hard to settle a debate over something we've never really searched for in the locations where it's most likely to be found. Picture this. Suppose every trace of modern civilization were confined to Central Australia, the Amazon rainforest, and the heart of Antarctica, while the only place we'd ever examined was coastal California, and from that narrow sample we were trying to judge whether advanced human societies had ever existed. And that, in essence, is where we stand regarding Ice Age coastal communities. The evidence exists. We're simply searching in the wrong locations because the correct ones are submerged. So if someone insists that no advanced societies existed prior to 6,000 years ago, they're really only saying that no such evidence has turned up on dry ground. And that's precisely the outcome we'd predict, given that those ancient populations occupied shorelines that now sit roughly 300 feet beneath the sea. This sunken world is no mere theory. It actually exists, resting beneath the surface, ready to be found. Each methodical exploration of the continental shelf uncovers fresh formations, and every dive into submerged ruins deepens our awareness of all that the advancing oceans have taken from us. It's not a question of whether coastal civilizations existed 12,000 years ago. The true question is when we will invest the resources needed to locate them. Until that day comes, we are constructing human history from the few fragments left on higher ground, turning a blind eye to the enormous trove of evidence hidden beneath the ocean. And that evidence will not simply vanish. It has waited for 11,600 years already, and it can wait a little longer. But the longer we delay our search, the more we allow our own assumptions about antiquity to keep us from learning what truly happened. Beneath the water lie the remains, villages, ports, landmarks, all the traces left by shoreline communities who witnessed their homeland gradually disappear. All we need is the courage to dive down and uncover them. Now we reach the truly fascinating part. When those coastlines were buried under hundreds of feet of rising sea, some people endured. Certainly not everyone. Thousands, perhaps millions, lost their lives as the waters advanced. Yet a few found a way through. They retreated to higher terrain and built boats. They pushed inland ahead of the rising tides. And those who survived behaved the way humans always behave after catastrophe. They told stories. Jump to the 19th century. European academics are decoding ancient manuscripts from across the globe and begin noticing something strange. Every culture, every civilization around the globe has a flood myth. Not just vague similarities, but stories that share the same fundamental plot, the same crucial details, the same narrative skeleton. Their first conclusion was that this proved the Bible's literal authenticity. Noah's Ark, they believed, was the original account, and all the other flood legends were corrupted copies handed down by Noah's sons. Classic Victorian logic. Yet further digging revealed a far more complex story. Unearthed amid the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh long predated the biblical flood account. The tablets that carry the flood story date back to roughly 2100 B.C.E., centuries earlier than the oldest biblical writings. In this version, the hero Utnapishtim is warned by a deity that a massive flood is on its way. He is instructed to construct a great vessel, coat it with tar, and load it with his kin and pairs of every kind of animal. Does that ring a bell? Then the deluge arrives, raging for 7 days and 7 nights. The waters engulf all, even the highest peaks. When they eventually withdraw, Utnapishtim's ship settles upon a mountain slope. He sends out a dove, then a swallow, then a raven, in search of dry land. Only the raven fails to return, an indication that the flood had subsided enough for life to resume. The parallels with the story of Noah are so precise that scholars understood the two tales had to be linked. It seemed either one narrative borrowed from the other, or both descended from an even older source. Yet then they came upon comparable stories among cultures that had never encountered the Middle East. In Hindu tradition, there is the tale of Matsya. Vishnu assumes the shape of a colossal fish, serving as a warning for King Manu that a catastrophic flood is imminent. Manu builds a large ship, fills it with seeds and animals, and secures it to Matsya's horn. The fish pulls the vessel through the cosmic sea for years, until the floodwaters settle and life is able to start over. This story survives in texts dating back to at least 1500 B.C.E., and likely originated long before that in oral tradition. The ancient Greeks also told of Deucalion and Pyrrha. Upset by the wickedness of humanity, Zeus resolves to obliterate people with a great flood. Prometheus cautions his son Deucalion, who builds an ark and takes his wife Pyrrha aboard. They sail for 9 days and 9 nights, finally arriving at Mount Parnassus. Once the waters recede, they begin the task of repopulating the earth. The details differ, new names, new gods, but the central storyline remains constant. A holy warning, construction of a vessel, rescue by floating, a mountain landing, and rebirth of the human race. And now comes the truly intriguing part. These are not limited to the Old World. Indigenous civilizations across the Americas had their own deluge myths. The Hopi, for instance, recounted 3 previous worlds that had been wiped out. The last of those was destroyed by water. The survivors managed to escape by hiding inside hollow reeds, which stayed buoyant on the surface until the flood withdrew. The Aztecs, on their part, recorded that the 4th sun, the age before our own, ended when Chalchiuhtlicue, their water goddess, overwhelmed the earth. Humans managed to live by turning into fish, with a handful later changed back so the land could be repopulated. In South America, the indigenous people of the Andes tell stories of a devastating flood that consumed the world. In one version from the pre-Inca cultures, a llama warns its shepherd that the ocean is about to surge upward and cover everything. The shepherd and his family race to a high peak, bringing their animals with them. The waters rise so high that they nearly reach the summit, and the llama frets that even this height might be insufficient. Eventually the waters fall, and the family comes down to discover they are the only people left alive. Indigenous tribes from all over North America have their own flood traditions. The Ojibwe speak of Nana Bojo, who ascends to the crown of the tallest tree standing upon the highest mountain peak. When the flood waters spread across the world, he sends forth a raven first, and after it a muskrat, to locate ground hidden beneath the deluge. The Snohomish of the Pacific Northwest recount an era when the ocean climbed so high that the mountain peaks themselves vanished beneath the water. Those who endured tied their canoes to the highest summits and waited for the waters to recede. These tales were recorded during the 1700s and 1800s, well before these communities had any meaningful contact with Christian missionaries from Europe. They cannot be understood as borrowed scripture. They are truly indigenous. These are ancient traditions carried through hundreds of generations. In Australia, Aboriginal peoples possess stories of the sea swelling to flood the coastal territories. The Gunditjmara, from the southeastern part of the continent, remember a time when sea levels were far lower and their ancestors could journey by land to islands that exist now. Then the waters climbed swiftly, covering enormous stretches of land. Their accounts describe distinct landscape features that now rest beneath the waves. According to these traditions, Port Phillip Bay, today a wide inlet near Melbourne, once stood as dry land. And here's something striking. Geological evidence supports this. The bay truly was an open plain until roughly 10,000 years ago, when rising waters swept over it. The Aboriginal people of the Gulf of Carparia in northern Australia also hold traditions depicting that gulf as dry ground. It was a broad plain where people hunted, until the ocean rose and changed it into a shallow sea. Once again, geological findings confirm that the Gulf indeed remained exposed land during the last ice age, only to be flooded about 11,000 or 12,000 years back. Pacific island cultures possess similar accounts. Despite inhabiting volcanic islands never linked to an exposed continental shelf, the Polynesians carry legends of immense floods that obliterated older lands. Some academics believe these may be ancestral memories passed down from their place of origin in Southeast Asia, where catastrophic coastal inundation undoubtedly occurred. On the African continent, flood myths surface in cultures everywhere. The Kikuyu of Kenya recall a great flood that buried the earth beneath water, leaving only the highest mountains untouched. The Mandingo of West Africa hold to traditions of a calamitous flood that laid waste to the world. The Yoruba speak of a time when the original waters blanketed everything, until the god Owatala formed land. Now comes the truly remarkable part. If you chart the geographic spread of elaborate flood legends, particularly those with the greatest specificity and detail, you'll see them concentrated in the exact regions that would have suffered the most intense coastal flooding at the end of the last ice age. One such place is Southeast Asia, with its immense, uncovered continental shelves. The Persian Gulf region, where hundreds of thousands of square miles of fine land disappeared beneath the waves, plus the Mediterranean coasts, the Americas' Pacific shores, and northern Australia. These correspond exactly to the zones where Meltwater Pulse 1b would have triggered the most catastrophic flooding. The chronology aligns as well. Experts who study oral traditions estimate that detailed stories can survive with reliability for perhaps 10,000 years, and at most 12,000, before distortion erases their specific content. That matches the period we're discussing between the main flood event and today, a span estimated at 11,000 to 600 years. Yet there is a genuine scholarly controversy here. Some researchers argue that flood myths are widespread because flooding itself is widespread. Every culture endures floods, waterways overflow, storms drive surges onshore, and tsunamis batter coastlines. As a result, each people forms stories to explain these repeated catastrophes, and the tales naturally come to share similar patterns because human minds work alike everywhere. Psychologist Carl Jung would have viewed them as archetypal tales born from the collective unconscious, not from genuine historical recollection. That skeptical perspective prevailed through most of the 1900s. Flood legends were regarded as fascinating artifacts of culture with no historical weight. Then, marine archaeology reversed the field completely. Once investigators systematically examined the continental shelves with sonar and submersibles, discoveries started coming. They found submerged river channels, exactly where Aboriginal traditions claimed rivers had once flowed. They found drowned landscapes that matched the oral records of Pacific Islanders. And off the coast of India, they located ancient stone structures underwater, in spots where tradition mentioned cities lost to the sea. Toward the end of the 1990s, oceanographers made a stunning find in the Black Sea. Evidence on the seafloor pointed to a catastrophic deluge about 7,600 years ago. The waters of the Mediterranean had risen, breached a natural barrier, and rushed into a huge lake that had previously been fresh. In a span of mere months, the lake's water level climbed by hundreds of feet, covering thousands of square miles of occupied land. And here's the connection. The cultures surrounding the Black Sea, ancestors of the people who later recorded the Epic of Gilgamesh, would have been there to live through this flood directly. It may well be that this flood lies behind the Mesopotamian deluge myth. Yet the Black Sea event came 4,000 years after Meltwater Pulse 1b. It might have acted to reinforce older memories, adding fresh elements to stories already in circulation. Alternatively, several catastrophic floods could have occurred, each enriching the culture's memory of one great flood. The strongest case for the historical reliability of flood legends lies in their particularities. This is not merely a story about a general deluge. Many accounts mention distinct characteristics of sea level rise that storytellers inventing myths would never think to include. On the Andaman Islands in the Indian Ocean, the local people carry a tradition that their ancestors once occupied a much bigger island, but the ocean rose up and shattered it into numerous small fragments. Bathymetric surveys demonstrate that the Andamans did indeed belong to a far larger landmass during the last ice age, and that the rising sea broke it apart into the present-day archipelago. In Australian Aboriginal lore, there is memory of an era when one could journey on foot to the place now called Kangaroo Island, just off South Australia's shoreline. These stories recount in vivid detail how the land bridge was swallowed by the sea, and archaeological findings indicate it was finally cut off by rising ocean levels some 11,000 years ago. That amounts to 440 generations of storytelling, faithfully preserving accurate geographical knowledge. The Timian people of British Columbia tell of a mountain that was once an island. Geological research confirms this peak, now part of the coastline, truly existed as an island until roughly 12,000 years ago, when a brief cold period caused sea levels to drop and joined it to the continent. Later, climbing waters turned it back into a peninsula, and the oral stories recorded both changes. These are no shadowy legends, they are precise geographical memories handed down over hundreds of generations. Anthropologist Patrick Nunn has devoted years to studying Aboriginal Australian coastal myths and their correspondence with actual geological shifts. He has documented numerous cases where oral lore describes specific shoreline features submerged by rising waters between 13,000 and 7,000 years ago. Geological evidence backs these narratives with amazing precision. So how is such a thing possible? How can oral lore sustain accurate information for 400 to 500 generations? The solution lies in the very architecture of traditional knowledge sharing. These were not casual tales around a fire that drifted into random variations. Instead, they were sacred traditions, frequently linked to initiation rites, land claims, and cultural identity. Indigenous peoples crafted elaborate mnemonic methods to guarantee faithful transmission. The narratives were bound to songs, dances, and ritual events. They were attached to specific sites and seasonal ceremonies. Since several members of the community knew them, there was deliberate redundancy. Getting a story wrong often brought consequences, socially or spiritually. Aboriginal traditions in Australia clearly reflect this disciplined transmission. Sea level rise stories are frequently woven into song lines, the old walking routes across the terrain, serving as navigational aids and as encyclopedic archives of cultural wisdom. Such a songline might trace a journey across a landscape that is now submerged. In doing so, it keeps alive the image of the ancient terrain. It is crafted in a way that is almost impossible to lose or change. But another factor also contributes. These stories held true importance. They were not amusement, but life-saving wisdom. If your ancestors almost perished in a devastating flood, you would absolutely see to it that your children and grandchildren were told. You would share where the waters came from, how high they climbed, and where people found safety. This is useful knowledge, capable of saving lives, should such an event ever occur again. Information of that sort is handed down with much more fidelity than casual legend. Across the globe, flood stories typically contain the same ingredients: a divine warning, the construction of a boat, the saving of animals, and mountain hideaways. Rather than being purely mythological creations, these stories may describe real survival tactics. Living on a coastal plain and witnessing the water advance daily, then yearly, you would inevitably search for higher ground. Thus, mountains became places of refuge. If the flood advanced at a slow enough pace, people would collect supplies, strive to save seeds, shelter livestock, and build boats or rafts to escape. And since every culture of that era believed in gods, they would view the catastrophe through a religious lens. The gods are furious. They bring the flood, and they alert the virtuous, who escape with their lives. The actual argument is not a simple choice between tales being separate creations or all descending from a single source. It is far more complex, and the truth probably embraces both possibilities. There truly was a historical catastrophe, the rapid sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, affecting coastal peoples across the globe. Each society that endured it developed its own traditions to describe the ordeal. Through thousands of years, these traditions were sharpened, gaining mythological and religious layers. In later times, as populations spread and civilizations encountered one another, some of these traditions cross-fertilized. The Mesopotamian story appears to have had an impact on the Hebrew account. Likewise, the Greek story might owe a debt to exchanges with Middle Eastern cultures. Yet underneath all the cultural refinement and merging of tales rests a nucleus of genuine history. The waters unquestionably rose, coastlands were inundated, societies crumbled, and those who came after remembered. That memory endured for 11,600 years. It was preserved in stories that look like mythology, but carry factual content about very real catastrophes. Only now, with the aid of modern marine archaeology and geology, are we able to corroborate what they have been telling us all along. The world was engulfed, and we lived through it. That is not myth, it is history. So consider this unsettling question, the one that keeps archaeologists tossing and turning at night. When those floods swept away 11 million square kilometers of habitable terrain, whose lives were truly being erased, the thing about shoreline communities is that they remain unseen. We locate ancient remains inland simply because those spots are still accessible. They lie beneath deserts, valleys, and mountain caves, waiting patiently for someone to uncover them. The shore, though, sits 120 meters below the water's surface. Everything that once existed there, every settlement, every trading post, every seasonal encampment, every invention is gone. For 11,600 years, it has all rested beneath layers of silt and salt water. That ought to worry you, not for any eerie reason, but because of what it implies about our grasp of human history. Our entire story of civilization rests on what we can physically recover, on the communities that happen to survive inland. Yet, what if the most desirable places to dwell, the richest lands, the great hubs of population and creativity, were all found along the coasts? At the glacial peak, the deepest freeze of the entire ice age, these people invented refined hunting strategies, intricate social connections, and long-distance trade routes that carried obsidian, shells, and other precious goods over hundreds of miles. This was not a simple people leading simple existences. They were advanced hunter-gatherers who knew their landscapes intimately, including seasonal animal movements, healing herbs, wildlife habits, and even how to navigate by the stars. Many groups already occupied semi-permanent settlements, returning to familiar sites year after year and erecting structures built to endure for many generations. And where were the finest spots for such communities? On the coast. Coastal landscapes are, beyond question, treasure troves of resources. Fish, shellfish, seaweed, seabirds, and their eggs, seals, sea turtles, and marine mammals all abound. Boats make movement effortless. Pathways of trade run along the shoreline, connecting distant communities. Estuaries, where fresh water meets the ocean, generate extraordinarily rich habitats that attract large numbers of game and edible vegetation. Elementary ecological reasoning suggests that coastal dwellers were more numerous, more permanently rooted, and more sophisticated than those farther inland. They enjoyed more dependable food sources, could maintain denser populations, had more prospects for specialized crafts and exchange, and could build knowledge that was passed along. This could continue for many generations without the constant turmoil of migration, but now we cannot see them. They lie beneath the water. The only clues are those strange leftovers preserved on land sites, so unusual, so advanced, so jarringly out of step with our usual timeline, that they make us question everything we assumed. Think about Göbekli Tepe. About 11,500 years ago, shortly after the Great Deluge, a person in southeastern Turkey set out to create something never attempted before in human history. Enormous stone pillars, some weighing as much as 20 tons, were decorated with elaborate carvings of animals, geometric shapes, and abstract symbols, arranged in circular enclosures that necessitated countless hours of organized effort. The builders, according to mainstream archaeological dating, were supposed to be uncomplicated hunter-gatherers with no complex social hierarchy or architectural know-how. Yet here is what makes Göbekli Tepe truly astonishing. Farmers did not build it. There is absolutely no trace of farming at the location. No cultivated crops or domesticated creatures appear, nor any permanent dwellings. The people responsible were hunter-gatherers, wandering groups who found a way to coordinate gangs capable of cutting, hauling, sculpting, and positioning stones that could tax contemporary building equipment. That simply shouldn't be possible. Every idea we held about human social evolution insisted that agriculture was the necessary first step. You required surplus food to sustain craftsmen who were not constantly foraging for meals. You required settled populations who remained in one place long enough to justify enormous construction projects. Göbekli Tepe demonstrates that we got it wrong, completely wrong. It shows that intricate social structures, monumental building projects, and refined symbolic cultures could develop before farming, before cities, before everything we saw as essential to civilization. And then comes the truly intriguing part. Göbekli Tepe is not a lone phenomenon any longer. Over the past 2 decades, many similar locations have been discovered throughout the Middle East and Anatolia. Karahan Tepe, Nivali Chori, Harbetsuvan Tepesi, Sefer Tepe, and Sayburts. All these were built around 11 to 10,000 years ago, and all present massive stone constructions, intricate carvings, and evidence of organized work that supposedly should not exist among hunter-gatherer groups. They are all situated inland, set far away from any shore, whether ancient or present day. That naturally leads to a question. If inland hunter-gatherers were capable of constructing Göbekli Tepe, what might coastal peoples have been creating? Picture yourself as a survivor of that catastrophe. The floods have taken your home, your ancestral lands, everything your people had known for generations. You have fled toward the interior, carrying only what you could grab. You are traumatized, scattered, and living on territory where strangers already reside. Yet you still recall the old ways, the shore settlements, the boats, the navigation skills, the social arrangements that allowed your people to prosper in better times. You need to build anew, to produce some physical sign of what was lost, some means of preserving the knowledge and unity that held your people together before disaster arrived. And so you build, not homes, those came later, and not fortifications, those could wait. You raise ritual structures, gathering places, architectural expressions of cosmic harmony, spaces where survivors from far and wide can come together, share wisdom, maintain their relationships, and pass essential knowledge down to the next generation. That, perhaps, is what Göbekli Tepe and its companion sites actually represent. Emergency projects for cultural preservation undertaken by coastal refugees determined to prevent the complete disappearance of their social and technological inheritance. The timing strongly supports this reading. Most of these megalithic monuments date from 11,500 to 10,000 years ago, precisely after the Great Floods, exactly when you would expect displaced populations to be regrouping inland, fashioning new social systems, and attempting to hold on to whatever they could from the world that had been swallowed by the sea. The carvings of animals found at these places depict sea-dwelling creatures, seabirds, fish, marine hunters, species vital to coastal life, yet almost unknown to those living inland. In carving these stone images, the builders were holding on to memories of a former existence, a world that had vanished beneath the waves. The standard archaeological reaction, however, follows a familiar pattern. Produce the evidence, they demand the coastal towns, harbors, marketplaces, the advanced civilizations said to predate the Great Floods. Provide tangible proof that those living by the sea were more developed than their inland counterparts. Yet such proof remains largely out of reach, hidden beneath the waters except for those rare instances when it doesn't. Over the past 3 decades, underwater archaeology has started uncovering precisely what would be anticipated if advanced seafaring communities had thrived prior to the deluge. Sunken stone complexes have been located off India, Japan, and in the Mediterranean. Ancient coastlines, bearing scatterings of tools and fire pits, now rest 60 meters beneath the surface. Additionally, intact shipwrecks and navigation instruments demonstrate that pre-agricultural peoples possessed remarkable seafaring skills. In the Gulf of Kat, off the Indian state of Gujarat, researchers have discovered underwater structures that certain experts believe display traces of city planning, grid-like street patterns, foundations of buildings, and objects, indicating deliberate construction. Mainstream archaeologists, however, remain cautious, reminding us that submerged sites are notoriously tricky to interpret, that natural rock formations can mimic human design, and that reliable dating poses serious difficulties. Yet doubt alone does not make evidence vanish. It simply reveals our unease with what that evidence implies. Now consider genetics, and here the story becomes especially intriguing, because population genetics remains entirely indifferent to the politics of archaeology. Genetics simply preserves the record of events. Examining the genetic variety present in today's human populations, an odd pattern emerges. Numerous population bottlenecks coincide precisely with the era of the Great Floods. Drastic falls in genetic variation are followed by swift population growth and movements away from coastal lands toward the interior. This is precisely the pattern one would predict if vast coastal communities had been overwhelmed by rising waters, suffered enormous losses, and then pushed the remaining survivors inland. The genetic marker of a catastrophic coastal flood is etched deeply into our very DNA. Only in recent times have we begun to search for such signs. Migration patterns offer even deeper insight. According to genetic studies, substantial human dispersals took place between 12 and 10,000 years ago. Populations originating on the coasts spread swiftly inland, merging with those already living there, and giving rise to fresh genetic lines that carry ancestry from both worlds. These were not slow, gradual movements unfolding over millennia. These were abrupt dislocations, the unmistakable genetic signature of refugees. And the refugees carried knowledge in their minds. Seafaring technology, navigational methods, systems of social organization, astronomical understanding, architectural ideas, the accumulated wisdom of countless generations dwelling along the shore. This could solve one of the greatest riddles of humanity's deep past. Why did farming emerge so rapidly, across so many scattered lands, at nearly the same moment? For generations, scholars have grappled with the puzzle of the Neolithic transition. Roughly 10,000 years ago, civilizations spread across the globe. Each began taming plants and animals on their own, separated by only a few thousand years. In the Middle East, wheat and barley were cultivated. In China, rice was domesticated. Mesoamerica produced corn. The Andes brought potatoes into cultivation. And New Guinea saw the farming of taro and bananas. The whole of humanity, it seems, suddenly agreed that farming was worth trying after eons spent hunting and foraging. The standard answer points to climate change as the driving force. Once the last ice age ended and temperatures rose, the giant mammals disappeared, making the hunting of big game far less dependable. People were forced to produce food more intensely, which supposedly led to farming appearing in several places independently. This sounds plausible enough, except that it leaves the remarkable synchronicity unexplained. Why would so many distinct regions embrace agriculture within the same few millennia, rather than developing it slowly over tens of thousands of years? And yet, what if agriculture was never an invention at all? What if it was something remembered? Consider a different possibility. Perhaps coastal communities had already been engaging in early forms of agriculture prior to the floods. They tended wild plants, chose the most favorable traits, and developed semi-cultivated varieties that needed little care. Then the great waters arrived, sweeping away those shoreline settlements and driving the survivors into less bountiful lands. In these less abundant territories, intensive farming became essential to sustain numbers that had once been comfortably supported by coastal fishing and foraging. The displaced people scaled up their existing methods, transforming proto-agriculture into full-fledged farming and pushing cultivation to its limits out of sheer necessity. This neatly accounts for agriculture's sudden and simultaneous appearance across many regions. This was not a story of separate discoveries, but of carried wisdom being put to use in unfamiliar surroundings by people left with no alternatives. The so-called Neolithic Revolution was less a revolution than a response to overwhelming upheaval. It also offers a reason for the complex social structures that materialize abruptly in the archaeological record right after the floods. How could communities dismissed as primitive foragers have known how to coordinate massive communal work efforts? How did they manage to forge trade routes across hundreds of miles, devise elaborate belief systems, and erect lasting towns featuring advanced construction? The answer may be that they were never simple foragers at all. Rather, they were survivors of advanced coastal cultures attempting to rebuild all that they had lost. And so we arrive at the contentious proposal that truly sophisticated civilizations flourished before the great floods, only to be utterly annihilated, leaving behind mere fragments and cultural echoes. Enthusiasts of ancient astronaut ideas are very fond of the Atlantis, Lemuria, and Mu stories, the entire genre of lost continents that frustrates professional archaeologists. In truth, the vast majority of it lacks substance. For 12 millennia or so, we find no trace of advanced urban centers, no metallic implements, no script, no wheels, no tamed livestock, virtually none of the hallmarks we link to civilized life. Yet that is a rather narrow way to define civilization. Suppose we broaden our perspective and acknowledge that sophistication need not match our familiar notion of technology. A community might be exceptionally structured, rich in cultural depth, and skilled in building, even if it left no metal objects or writing. A Stone Age people were not primitive in mind. It simply implies the enduring implements we find are carved from rock. The crucial issue is not the existence of vanished advanced cultures. It is our definition of advancement. Should we use technological parity with the Bronze Age or later eras as the standard, then no such proof appears. If, however, we use a more expansive definition, populations exhibiting refined social structures, broad trading connections, impressive public works, precise celestial observation, elaborate ceremonies, and the means to sustain skilled artisans, then the answer is yes. A growing body of evidence points to such communities residing along coastlines before the great floods. They did not raise starships or pyramids, yet they may have constructed magnificent timber buildings, seafaring vessels for long voyages, and intricate communities capable of hosting hundreds or even thousands of residents. After more than 11,600 years beneath the sea, all of that would have disappeared from the archaeological evidence. Timber decays, cords crumble, natural matter breaks down beyond trace. Only stone tools remain, and those reveal little about societal intricacy. But something else endures as well: memory. That cultural inheritance travels from one generation to the next, woven into folklore, tales, and narratives of origin. Observing deluge legends across different lands reveals a remarkable pattern. These are not merely accounts of waters climbing higher. They speak of knowledge that vanished, cultures that were crushed, and the fortunate few who began anew from almost nothing. The Sumerian deluge tale goes beyond describing the event. The narrative portrays an earlier age, city-dwelling kings, significant learning, and a thriving civilization. Then the catastrophe arrives, wiping out all that exists, and the survivors must restart from the ruins. The Bible's flood account echoes the same structure. A realm grown intricate and morally decayed is engulfed by water, leaving only a devoted small group to survive and resettle the world. In the Hindu Matsya Purana, Manu the primal man is saved from a vast flood and preserves the Vedas, the hallowed lore that must never be forgotten. Indigenous American legends recall people scrambling to high peaks as floodwaters swallowed the plains below. Polynesian tradition speaks of islands swallowed between the waves, compelling ancestors to sail onward toward new shores. Australian Aboriginal oral histories mention eras when the shoreline lay much farther outward, and stretches of seafloor were dry, populated ground. These narratives are not the same tale. They emerge from separate societies, separate continents, separate language families. Even so, their recurring themes become hard to dismiss as mere legend. They go beyond origin stories. They show a cycle of ruin and renewed creation. They recount a vanished world that the survivors, still carrying the ancient customs, were forced to reconstruct. This is the mark of deep collective grief groups, uprooted by disaster, and preserving that recollection through storytelling across many millennia. This does not prove that sophisticated civilizations once vanished, but it aligns with the notion that intricate coastal communities thrived before the deluges, and that their demise remained in the memory of survivors for thousands of years afterward. The scholarly debate over this is sharp. Conventional archaeology rightly questions assertions that lack physical verification, and for good reason. The discipline has been misled time after time by exaggerated declarations of lost civilizations that ended up being geological quirks, wrongly read ruins, or complete fabrications. Caution is appropriate when remnants lie underwater and readings are ambiguous. Still, doubt should never harden into rigid belief. In truth, our knowledge of pre-flood coastal peoples remains nearly non-existent, since we cannot reach their towns. The whole architecture of our understanding about how human societies evolved rests on interior excavation sites that may not reflect the places where the majority truly made their homes. It is akin to seeking to comprehend today's world by digging solely in remote highland hamlets and disregarding the fact that most humans reside beside the sea. The reality likely falls between the two extremes. Certainly no ancient aliens, nor a super-advanced Atlantis with crystal-driven machines. Yet, it seems likely that coastal hunter-gatherer groups were highly advanced, more structured in society, further along in construction, and larger in population than the interior settlements that have drawn our attention. They did not match the classic definition of civilization. No written script, no enormous farming enterprises, no urban centers. Nevertheless, they possessed enough sophistication that their catastrophic loss set back the course of human society. So meaningful did they remain that descendants kept their memory alive for ages. And when these displaced peoples moved inward, they carried expertise that sparked the Neolithic Revolution and, ultimately, genuine civilization. The coastal inhabitants lost to the seas 11,600 years ago were by no means crude or uncivilized. They were, in fact, very much like us, bright, resourceful, and creative, having devoted millennia to crafting sophisticated ways of living in their surroundings. They built seafaring vessels, followed the stars to guide their journeys, exchanged goods over immense distances, organized large crews for communal projects, produced works of art, devised ceremonial practices, and carried their accumulated knowledge from parents to children. But when the great waters arrived, the majority of them perished. The survivors, however, became the root of our family tree. They moved inland, absorbed themselves into the communities already there, and over a few thousand years, their offspring went on to discover farming, erect towns, and form the earliest civilizations recorded in history. These civilizations are often called the cradles of human culture: Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China. Yet maybe cradle is not the right term. Perhaps they were successful settlements of refugees, established by people who had not forgotten a lost world, and who were resolved that the achievements of their ancestors would never disappear without a trace. That is what the coastal peoples were. They were us, before the world went under. And even though their settlements are no more, their heritage carried on. It lives in every farm, every ship, every navigational skill, every construction custom, and every flood. Myth that cautions all future generations about the threat of encroaching seas. Their mark is in our genes, in our rituals, and in the essential foundations of everything we name civilization. We are what they became after losing all they had, and we are their second opportunity. Now, 11,600 years have passed, and we find ourselves confronting the very same ocean rise they did, asking whether we can adapt any better than they managed to survive. This is where that old story becomes troublingly relevant to our world today, because what took place 11,600 years ago is much more than dry history. It is an omen, a warning inscribed on drowned coastlines and sunken settlements that we are still learning to interpret. Let's look at the figures, real and alarming as they are today. At this very moment, roughly 2.4 billion people live within 100 kilometers of an ocean coast. That amounts to nearly a third of all people on Earth. Around 600 million reside in coastal regions that lie under 10 meters above sea level, which in everyday terms is about the height of a 3-story building. A particularly bad storm surge, An unusually high tide combined with unfavorable atmospheric conditions would be enough to place those areas underwater. But our focus is no longer on storms. We are dealing with an irreversible rise in sea level. The predictions offer little reassurance. The more conservative climate models assume that we drastically reduce carbon emissions. Those models project an elevation in sea levels of at least 1 to 2 meters by the year 2100, a mere 76 years away. That falls well within the lifetime of anyone under 50 reading this. The less restrained models, which presume we stay on our current course, anticipate 2 to 3 meters of rise, perhaps even more. Now, 2 meters may not appear alarming. It's around 6.5 feet, and you could wade through it while still keeping your head above water. But in reality, a 2-meter rise in sea level means this. We would have to say goodbye to Miami. Not a portion of Miami, but the city in its entirety, since the whole urban area rests at an average elevation of less than 2 meters above the current sea. The downtown district, where millions live and work, with billions of dollars in property and infrastructure at stake, would remain permanently underwater. It would also say goodbye to Venice. That city, which has lasted for 1,500 years thanks to wooden foundations within a lagoon, would finally surrender to the advancing Adriatic Sea. It means losing the southern coast of Bangladesh, where 30 million people now live on ground that would be flooded. It means saying farewell to the Maldives, to Tuvalu, to Kiribati, entire countries that would simply disappear beneath the surface of the ocean. Huge sections of New York City, London, Shanghai, Mumbai, Bangkok, Jakarta, and hundreds of other major coastal cities would require permanent defenses against flooding, or would eventually need to be abandoned. And we are not talking about some far-off time. We are talking about choices that have to be made in the next 10 to 20 years. Infrastructure demands to be planned and built now. Populations must be moved soon. The total economic worth of infrastructure sitting in zones vulnerable to a 2-meter sea level rise exceeds $20 trillion. That number is not a typo. $20 trillion worth of buildings, roads, ports, and utilities stand on land destined to be underwater within most of our lifetimes. But here is what makes our predicament worse than the one from 11,600 years ago. When Meltwater Pulse 1b struck, when sea levels jumped by 13 to 15 meters over maybe 500 years, the people on those drowning coastlines still had choices. Terrible, cruel choices that forced them to give up everything they had created and head off on foot. But choices nonetheless. They could leave. They could travel deeper inland. There were new territories to find, new hunting grounds, new places to raise communities. The world then was mostly open land, with perhaps 5 million human beings scattered across the entire planet. As coastal groups fled inland, they discovered empty space. They found resources. They had the means to start again. For us, that option does not exist. Every piece of livable territory on Earth is already owned by someone. Every border stands guarded. Every resource has been divided up. If 600 million people living along the world's shores have to head for higher ground, what destination could possibly hold them all? Bangladesh alone cannot simply take in 30 million displaced souls. It's already among the most crowded places on the planet. Jakarta's 30 million inhabitants could hardly be moved to safer elevations without tearing apart the country's social and economic fabric. Nor could America simply walk away from Miami and New York to start again in another location. The cost of replacing all that infrastructure would crush even wealthy nations, and that's before factoring in whether governments would even work together. But will border crossings remain open? Will prosperous interior communities open their arms to climate refugees fleeing the coast? History whispers that such assumptions are dangerous. When supplies run thin and fear sets in, people rarely turn to kindness. Instead, they build barriers, some physical, some political, and psychological. Those early shoreline communities who escaped Meltwater Pulse 1b endured unimaginable terror, yet they did so when the Earth still offered empty places to take them in. Today we face comparable shifts, but there is no wilderness left to hide in. Of course, you might object. Wasn't that ancient flood-driven event spread over 5 centuries or more? Now, we're discussing a comparable rise in sea levels compressed into just 76 years far quicker, and you're correct to notice. Nothing in all of human history has seen change this rapid. Our forebears had many generations to adjust. We have only a handful of decades. Yet here's the truly unsettling twist. How fast Meltwater Pulse 1b actually unfolded remains an open question. Certain clues hint that most of those 13 to 15 meters of ocean advance occurred in as little as 1 to 2 centuries, perhaps even quicker. Coral reefs and ancient shorelines carry geological marks of abrupt, violent surges in water level. Not the slow, steady climb we once assumed, but sharp and devastating leaps. There were years when the sea climbed by whole meters instead of millimeters. And why is that important? Because it proves a terrifying point. Fast, catastrophic sea level rise isn't just a theory or a computer projection. It has already occurred within the span of human history, and there's no reason it can't return. Among the greatest unknowns in today's climate predictions lies the question of whether the great ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica will stay put. These are not ordinary glaciers. They are entire continents covered in ice kilometers deep, holding back enough frozen water to lift the world's oceans by more than 60 meters. Modern models assume the melting will be steady, forecastable, and straight line. Yet the paleoclimate archive from earlier warm intervals tells us otherwise. These ice sheets can give way abruptly, not over millennia but within decades, or sometimes within a mere handful of years. Once enormous ice shelves break away, and the glaciers they once pinned down surge forward into the sea, the ocean does not climb little by little. It lunges upward. We caught a glimpse back in 2002 when Antarctica's Larsen B shelf, covering an area comparable to Rhode Island, disintegrated in barely 5 weeks. That platform had stood solid for at least 10 millennia and then vanished. The glaciers it had held back reacted at once, racing into the sea at 5 times their previous speed. Yet, Larsen B was merely a modest shelf. Should the West Antarctic ice sheet become unstable, we'd face an additional 3 to 5 meters of ocean advance. Lose the Greenland ice sheet, and you add 7 more meters. If both sheets collapse, the resulting sea level rise would echo the dramatic flooding that closed the younger Dryas. But imagine that event striking a planet of 8 billion souls instead of a few million. A planet whose great cities hug the water's edge. A planet that has run out of open frontiers to flee toward. Now, to be fair, the majority of researchers consider such a catastrophic collapse improbable within the next 100 years. Yet emphasis falls on improbable, not impossible. The chance is nowhere near zero, and should it happen, many coastal nations would see the end of their entire way of life. That is precisely the sort of small odds, devastating impact threat that lingers in climate scientists' minds and robs them of sleep. But suppose the pessimists turn out to be mistaken. Suppose the oceans rise only 1 to 2 meters over the coming century. Even that would spell catastrophe. Hundreds of millions forced from their homes, trillions of dollars in infrastructure wiped out. And, unlike our distant ancestors, we have the chance to watch it approach. We can no longer deny it. We possess the measurements, the simulations, and the buried proof of ancient inundations. We fully understand what hangs in the balance. So what action are we taking? A few regions are rising to the challenge. The Netherlands, locked in a centuries-long struggle with the water, now crafts ever more ingenious barriers against the flood, shielding ground that lies beneath the ocean's surface. The Dutch have become masters of this craft, yet even their engineers concede there are boundaries. Sooner or later, the price of holding back the water exceeds the worth of the land being saved. There comes a moment when withdrawal is the only option. Venice, meanwhile, is testing movable floodgates designed to rise whenever dangerously high tides approach. An astounding feat of technical skill, but one designed for yesterday's weather, not the world that is coming. Each year, the floodgates must be lifted more often, and eventually, they will have to stay shut forever. When that day arrives, Venice will no longer be a city, but an aquarium. Elsewhere, other municipalities are looking seriously at planned withdrawal, purchasing vulnerable seaside homes, moving roads and utilities farther inland, and establishing open zones that can absorb rising waters without sweeping away people's houses. The price is enormous, and politicians shy away from it. No one wants to hear that their beloved house will lie beneath the water 3 decades from now. Still, the retreat proceeds slowly half-heartedly, nowhere near quickly enough. Meanwhile, other communities simply refuse to see. They raise fresh developments along shores doomed to flood, market oceanfront homes destined for submersion, and hand out 30-year loans for buildings that won't last 15. This is a shared illusion rooted in our inclination to expect tomorrow to mirror yesterday. That assumption is false. Yet the truly significant part is this. Grasping what occurred 11,600 years ago is vital to our own survival. Those prehistoric deluges imparted tough lessons about endurance and flexibility, lessons etched into our DNA and ancestral customs. We are only beginning to unearth these teachings once more. The first, coastlines are not fixed. Every legend of floods, every tale about a submerged world conveys the identical caution. Never construct your society on the belief that ocean levels remain constant. The sea level is not stable, and never has been. Each great civilization that endured the deluge owed its survival to keeping links with the interior, establishing trade routes, family bonds, and backup communities on higher ground. When shores were inundated, they could withdraw inland. Today's coastal metropolises, extremely specialized and cut off from their farming heartlands, no longer possess that adaptability. The second lesson concerns pace. A slow increase in sea level, even a major one unfolding over hundreds of years, can be handled. Societies have time to adjust, move gradually, and rebuild their structures piece by piece. But a sudden jump, the sort that could come with the disintegration of ice sheets, poses an existential threat. Losing a fifth of your livable territory within a single generation leaves no room for adaptation, only turmoil. The third lesson is that working together is the key to survival. Those societies, which came through the younger Dryas inundations, relied on systems of shared assistance. If one community was swamped, neighboring ones welcomed its displaced people. In times of scarcity, goods were divided among all. The only other outcome was breakdown. Contemporary nationalism, with its focus on frontiers and self-rule, is a privilege afforded by a steady climate. When seas advance and vast numbers, hundreds of millions, must relocate, these boundaries will either be thrown open willingly or will be breached by sheer desperation. The fourth lesson highlights the importance of safeguarding knowledge. The cultures that bounced back most quickly from the floods were the ones who held on to their technical expertise. How to fashion tools, how to cultivate crops, how to erect buildings. Because they retained that memory, they had no need to start from scratch. Rebuilding was possible. Our own civilization is vastly more intricate, yet also far more delicate. Should coastal urban centers be flooded and essential systems destroyed, would we be capable of reconstructing them? Is our expertise spread broadly enough, or does it sit mainly in those same coastal areas destined to be submerged? And in the end, the greatest lesson, the one that archaeological findings cry out from every sunken village and underwater monument, is this: heed the warnings. People in that distant era observed clear clues of transformation. Higher groundwater levels, more frequent inundations, increasingly violent storms. A few chose to relocate promptly. Others delayed, wishing the shifts would undo themselves, and that conditions were less dire than they appeared. The majority who tarried too long perished. The ocean engulfed their villages, erased their names, and kept their tales alive solely through flood legends and the genetic traces left by population crashes. Today, the same omens are appearing before us, but accompanied by records, precise readings, and forecasts. Unlike the ancients, we cannot plead ignorance. We are fully aware of what is unfolding. The reasons are clear to us, as is an approximate sense of our remaining time. It's not a matter of whether we'll act eventually, we will. Rather, will we act early enough to guide the transformation calmly, or will we postpone until an emergency leaves us no choice but frantic reaction? At this moment, investigations are moving ahead. Using cutting-edge sonar and underwater vehicles, marine archaeologists are scanning the continental shelves, charting Ice Age settlements that are now beneath the waves. Each new find fills in more pieces of the picture of that global flooding. The speed of the events, the way populations reacted, which strategies proved effective, and which failed these, are far more than mere archaeological oddities. They serve as detailed examples of how civilizations cope with climatic disaster, and what unfolds when rising seas are disregarded until no time remains. Those cautions lay inscribed on stone, on shell, and within sunken structures waiting 11,600 years for us to uncover. Certain researchers now advocate for comprehensive mapping of every continental shelf, an international initiative to document and investigate these underwater Ice Age sites before erosion or construction destroys them. Yet such undertakings face scarce political support and unpredictable financing. Still, the insights locked within those submerged places might prove essential to anticipating our own path. Consider this about those lost cultures. They were not foolish, not unenlightened, not primitive. They were people of ordinary intelligence, inhabiting a world they comprehended. They chose to settle along shores because those zones provided abundant resources, commercial pathways, and food. They poured effort into construction, fully expecting that it would endure. They brought up families and formed settlements, believing the future would carry on as before. That belief proved mistaken. The world transformed, oceans advanced, and all their creations were consumed by the water. Today we are wagering the very same way. We are assuming permanence within an inherently volatile system, erecting lasting structures along shorelines that will not remain. We are pouring trillions into urban centers, destined to fail before the century ends, and designing futures that will never come to be. Yet the distinction lies in our awareness. The data is in our hands, along with the warnings and the archaeological proof of what occurs when climbing oceans go unheeded. We possess every benefit that was denied to our forebears, with a single exception. Time is slipping away from us far more quickly than many appreciate. The immense coastal inundations that occurred 11,600 years ago wiped out societies we are just beginning to uncover. What confronts us isn't a matter of if today's coastal metropolises will meet a similar end. They certainly will. The real choice is whether we'll heed the lessons of history or relive them. Whether we'll adjust our ways while we still have a chance, or delay until the tide creeps up to our homes and we're left with no option other than to run. And so we find ourselves exactly where we were 11.5 millennia ago. Ice is thawing, seas are climbing, and a whole world slips beneath waters that will never fall back. But this time, you truly grasp what has been destroyed. This wasn't merely about territory, shorelines, or handy spots for raising communities. What vanished was entire civilizations, intricate cultures possessing their own inventions, their own commerce routes, and a vast body of wisdom gathered across millennia. All their expertise in seafaring, farming, stargazing, and healing was lost to us. We lost their creative works, their legends, and their view of the cosmos. Every bit of it now rests beneath 400 feet of ocean, still there in the darkness, patiently waiting. The proof is impossible to ignore. The layers of the Earth tell the tale without any doubt. Meltwater Pulse 1b drove sea levels up 16 feet in under 5 centuries. Shorelines pulled back miles into the land within the span of one human life. Vast river lowlands were swallowed by the sea. Islands disappeared completely. Huge stretches of continental shelf turned from living ground into the seabed. What lies beneath the waves now verifies all of it. Massive stone monuments sit off Japan's shores. Ancient stone circles rest in the Persian Gulf, and drowned towns are scattered from India all the way to the Mediterranean. Earthenware, implements, and the bases of dwellings have all been discovered in depths so great that no ancient culture could have constructed them. They must have been erected when those sites stood upon dry land, and indeed they did around 12,000 years ago. Customs and oral traditions confirm this as well. The great deluge legends are not simple fables, nor are they folklore born of ignorance, and they certainly aren't mere symbolic parables. These are first-hand narratives handed from one generation to the next across countless centuries. Too many specifics line up. Too many locations are precisely named. The chronology fits far too well. When peoples ranging from Mesopotamia to Australia, throughout the Pacific Islands, and across the Americas, all speak of one immense flood catastrophe, it isn't something to brush aside as chance. You simply acknowledge that it is genuine history. Yet what truly troubles my sleep is this. The pieces we've uncovered up to now form only an infinitesimal portion of what rests in the deep. Ponder that thought. We have charted under 5% of the ocean's bottom under 5%, so fully 95% of that sunken realm from 11,600 years ago is absolutely untouched, never inspected, totally lost to our awareness. Whole cities could lie waiting in those waters, thriving centers where thousands once lived, with grand structures that could stand alongside any marvel of the ancient era. Perhaps there are libraries, if they had mastered writing, along with art galleries, temples, marketplaces, and schools, all quietly tucked into the mud, anticipating their discovery. The Dogger Bank settlements are surfacing in the North Sea, the underwater villages along India's shores, the enormous stone constructions found upon continental shelves around the globe. None of these are isolated curiosities. They are merely examples. These scattered dots of evidence point to something far greater. For every site that has come to light, maybe hundreds more, have yet to be uncovered. For every relic retrieved, thousands still lie beneath the earth. And this isn't limited to monuments alone. There is also wisdom. The societies dwelling by the coasts that perished in those deluges had occupied those lands for countless generations. They had a deep awareness of how to voyage across the sea, how tides moved, how currents flowed, and how to make use of marine life. They created tools and methods shaped for shore life, mastered the craft of boat construction, and knew the ways of catching fish. Furthermore, their techniques for curing seafood, forecasting tempests, and adapting to shifting seasons, all that knowledge disappeared alongside them. Consider how very different our modern world could have been had those shoreline cultures endured. Had their collected wisdom somehow been kept and expanded rather than obliterated, we might well have achieved sophisticated ocean travel ages earlier. Long-distance commerce spanning the entire globe could have arisen during the Stone Age, rather than waiting for the Bronze Age. Perhaps the complete course of human invention and innovation would have taken an entirely different direction. But what actually happened was that those who lived through the catastrophe, the folk who had made their homes farther inward, at higher elevations, safely distant from the shore and its relentless waters, found themselves forced to rebuild from scratch. Well, not precisely from nothing. They held on to recollections of that vanished realm and told stories about its glories. Yet they had no way to reach the deep well of knowledge possessed by those coastal societies, none to examine their inventions, and none to expand upon their milestones. So humanity's story veered toward a different road, the one we are familiar with today. Farming took shape in river basins rather than on seaside flats. Towns arose in the interior, not along old water's edge. The craft of sailing progressed gradually and with great difficulty, reinventing things that shoreline dwellers may have refined long before. When those great floods swept through 11,600 years ago, they didn't only swallow up the earth. They also submerged countless possibilities, alternate paths, distinct futures that we as a species might have followed had those coastal cultures lived on to guide our evolution. And the ocean still guards those mysteries, holding them in its chilly gloom, ever watchful. And that brings us full circle to the very question we began with. What more lies hidden beneath the water? What other traces of advanced pre-Diluvian cultures are still waiting to be found on submerged continental shelves across the globe? What inventions, what accomplishments, what wisdom about the world were swallowed by the sea? That remains a mystery, at least for now. Year after year, though, underwater archaeologists bring new discoveries to light. Each expedition uncovers the unexpected. Each sonar sweep reveals formations that would be impossible in their present location unless the coastlines had once been dramatically different. Gradually, the sunken world is yielding its mysteries. Step by step, site by site, artifact by artifact, piece of evidence by piece of evidence, we realize that our knowledge of humanity's ancient past has gaps, that a full chapter of our species' story is inscribed in the mud and stone lying beneath the ocean. So, if this video gave you a fresh perspective on ancient history, go ahead and hit that like button. Leave a comment to tell me where you're listening from, and if your part of the world has its own flood legends or submerged ruins. And subscribe, because we're going to keep uncovering these timeless riddles, continuing to dive into the proof that challenges every assumption we had about the dawn of human civilization. Because somewhere down there, in the shadows of those shelflands that were once open coastal plains, the drowned world is silently waiting to be remembered. And when we finally carry its secrets up into the light, we may find that human civilization is far more ancient, far more advanced, and far more captivating than we ever dared to imagine.